Chapter 687. Edward was in a killing frenzy when he suddenly heard a mumbling incantation. He raised his head abruptly and saw a dwarf with bone ornaments in the depths of the treetops reciting witchcraft incantation at him. A strong sense of vigilance reminded him that even if he was a reincarnator, he would not benefit from this witchcraft incantation. At this moment, a gunshot rang out, and the dwarf wizard was shot through the left eye. His brain and skull came out of the back of his head. His body fell from a tree and fell at Edward's feet. Edward turned back gratefully, only to see Chun Ong easily shooting and finishing off the more troublesome aborigines. Soon these aborigines were killed and retreated. Seeing the aborigines roaring and retreating without fear and pain, the reincarnators breathed a sigh of relief. Comparing the intensity of the battle, they found that if it had not been for Chun Ang's reminder, they would not have been able to defeat the aborigines so easily. David took a deep breath and said to Chun Ong, "Doctor, what should we do next?" Chun Ong looked in the direction where the dwarf retreated, then shook his head and smiled. "Don't worry, they can't disturb us anymore. Next, full speed forward like a pyramid." David wanted to say something, but when he saw Edward follow without hesitation, he did not speak. They hadn't gone far when they heard the roar of the Gatling gun in the distance. The scene of bullets and chains of fire tearing through flesh and blood seemed to be vivid in their minds. Edward then whispered in David's ear, "Don't you know this guy? He said that no one will disturb us, but he definitely does not mean, I don't think they will disturb us again. But they're all dead. Didn't you notice that since those dwarves came out, those big octopuses with the Gatling gun have disappeared?" David's face changed, and he looked in the direction of the gunshot in horror. As they walked forward, they vaguely found some traces of Imodin and the others. "It's here," Edward said slowly. A small camp appeared in front of them. Imodin and the others should have rested here for a while. There were footprints and traces of trampled plants on the ground. Zhang Ziqiang gently rubbed the dried mud and said quietly, "At least 6 hours." David's expression immediately changed. "So, they were already here when we came in? We arrived at the Amesy Oasis only half an hour later than them. How could they finish the journey that took us 6 hours in half an hour? Even without Anubis's interference, it's still impossible," David said with an ugly expression. Zhang Ziqiang said in a low voice, "This way, we won't be able to intercept them before they start the challenge. Have you ever considered why they are resting here after walking for only half an hour?" Chun Ong asked with a smile. Edward and the others frowned when they heard this. Indeed, if it wasn't for the fact that they had expended too much energy trekking in the jungle, they shouldn't be resting here, right? Edward muttered. "You're saying that they use some kind of method that expends a lot of energy?" Chun Ong only shook his head slightly and hinted, "Although some of the places we passed by had lush vegetation and didn't seem to have any traces, there were some places where the vegetation was broken too recently. It's not that the wounds are fresh, but that the plants themselves are very fresh, tender, and juicy, just like plants that have been sprouted in a greenhouse. They're newly grown." Chun Ang's eyes were like lightning as he said decisively, "And Imodin has no reason to avoid us. In fact, we are an important part of his plan. He should be expecting us to follow him to the site of the ritual, so he has no reason to set up obstacles for us. At this point, the conclusion is very clear. Anubis sprouted these plants. Not only is he hiding something, but he's also using this to stop us and separate us from Imodin, causing a misalignment in time." Edward asked, "Then what is he hiding?" Chun Ong pulled out a long sword with his right hand and cut on the ground not far away. A fallen leaf seemed to be stuck to the tip of the sword, and Chun Ong showed it to everyone. The fallen leaf on the tip of the sword was an evergreen broadleaf, a common tree species in the rainforest. The difference was that only a small piece of the leaf remained near the leaf stalk, and the neat cut showed that this was not a natural loss. Luo Sheng took the leaf and said, "This is not caused by a weapon. The cut is also smooth when you look at the microscopic level. Such a precise cut, if not made by a modern machine tool, must be caused by space." After careful observation, Edward also nodded and said, "I agree. Only a space-level attack can cause such a smooth cut. Everyone looked at Chun-Ong, however, cast his gaze into the distance thoughtfully and said softly, "It seems that we have information about one of the four mysterious people. It should be one of the two auras that we can't distinguish. That aura is deep and profound. Along the way, I have always felt a similar aura lingering around. This unique aura that is neither on this shore nor on the other shore, nor in the middle reminds me of a special spatial equation." Edward's expression changed. Fourier transform. Seeing the puzzled gazes of the others, Edward had no choice but to explain. The spatial Fourier transform equation generally refers to the wave equation of quantum mechanics, which represents the real space of reality. After the Fourier transform, the corresponding imaginary solution will be obtained. This solution with mathematical meaning, if converted according to its practical meaning, represents another space corresponding to the real space, the imaginary space, also known as the Fourier space. Chun-Ong did not comment on Edward's explanation, but whispered, "It seems that among the four mysterious people we are looking for, one of them has mastered the means of the Fourier transform of space, banishing things from the real space, or replacing them into the imaginary space. If one of you is unfortunate enough to be transformed like this once," Chun-Ong suddenly laughed, "then even the Lord can't save you." At this time, the image of a mysterious woman with a veil suddenly appeared in Chun-Ong's mind. When the woman opened her eyes, everything in front of her turned into nothingness, and there was nothing in her eyes. It was as if there was an abyss, a darkness that connected to another world. Wherever she looked, everything turned into nothingness. Imogen took her and the other mysterious people to the Ames oasis. The woman opened her eyes, and her veil disappeared without a trace. Imogen and the others fell far behind her, and everywhere the woman looked, everything disappeared. She walked straight toward the pyramid, and the jungle split into a straight path. Chapter 688. After knowing the truth, Edward and the others looked very upset. It was obvious that Anubis was already very afraid of them. He would rather use his divine power to grow the plants in the Amesy oasis than let them meet up with Imogen and the others. Based on the current progress, when Imogen and the others reached the pyramid and unsealed the Scorpion Emperor, they would still be far from the pyramid. If Imogen unseals the Scorpion Emperor, then the Death Guards will have a reason to appear. Do you think they will act according to the original plan and appear in the desert outside the Amethy Oasis to fight to the death with the Pharaoh's Imperial Guards? Or will they appear in front of us and kill me, a heretic who has humiliated Anubis multiple times? Chun-Ong asked with interest. Edward was already on the verge of tears. He said in a trembling voice, "Doctor, can you stop talking? This is making us very desperate." David suddenly said, "Doctor, can you teleport the airship here too? That way we can go directly to the pyramid, just like the protagonist did in the original work." Chun-Ong shook his head and said, "O'Connor is Anubis's own cheat, and we are now Anubis's mortal enemy. The Amesy Oasis is within its divine realm. Even with his interference, we can still sneak in because of our powerful technology. Bring the airship here? If he dares to transport it, I can use the space-based weather weapon to lock onto the coordinates of the Amesy Oasis and blow it up. Then we'll just wait for death here?" David questioned. "Why don't we teleport out for now and wait for Imogen and Anubis to decide who's better? Then we'll fight our way out." Chun-Ong did not pay attention to this idiot at all. Instead, he said to Edward and the others, "Now that the equipment here is simple, I may need some external help to open the spatial door, so what happens next may seem dangerous. Please rest assured that with my control, there will be no scenes that we do not want to see." David and the others were a little puzzled, but Zhang Ziqiang, who knew Chun-Ong better, had already looked at the remnant leaf in his hand in horror. Then he raised his eyes and looked into the distance. A few hours later, Imogen was only one step away from the pyramid. In the cover of the jungle, an unusually tall golden pyramid was revealed, and the trees here were gradually thinning. Next to Imogen, a beautiful Egyptian woman looked in the direction of the pyramid. Her eyes were like deep holes, and wherever she looked, everything quietly disappeared, opening up an empty path in front of Imodin and the others. Shun Tu Gong said carefully, "Master, do we go in now?" Imodin looked back in the direction behind them. He knew that Shun Tu Gong was reminding him that he needed Chun Ang's support to have any hope of successfully killing the god against Anubis. But the funny thing was that he and Chun Ang were not allies that could be trusted. On the contrary, the two were sworn enemies. Of course, this might be what Imodin thought. Chun Ang might just treat him as a chess piece. What was even funnier was that compared to his current allies, Imodin trusted Chun Ang more. This was not trust based on mutual understanding, but from the unforgettable memory that Chun Ang had left in front of Imodin that day. Imodin could not forget Chun Ang's eyes at that time. They were so indifferent, and in his eyes, Imodin could not find a trace of humanity. He was more like a god than any god Imodin had ever seen. Chun was like this. He had indifferently killed the love of his life and destroyed everything he once had. Imodin suddenly laughed wildly and said, "Didn't he mold me into what he wanted just for today? He molded everything he wanted according to his heart's desire, turning the world into what he expected. I can see that I am a relatively important existence in his plan. This is the fate he designed for me. I will bear everything, destroy everything old in Egypt, and pierce the spear of judgment into Anubis's chest. I will step on the flames of revenge and be reborn from the abyss. I will bring dusk to the gods and let the throne collapse in the flames of doomsday." Imhotep laughed nervously and said softly, "Then let's do it." His expression became indifferent as he walked towards the pyramid. Shun Tu Gong held back his impulse and silently followed Imhotep's footsteps. When they passed by one of the streams, Imhotep sneered and looked into the river. Shun Tu Gong immediately felt that something was wrong. He fiercely stabbed his sword towards a vague spot in the river. The 12th layer of Kunlun Earth Chi was like a cloud, pushing the heavy gravity of the earth and tearing that small stream apart. At this time, under the impact of the water, the group finally saw the appearance of the monsters in the river. They were 5 invisible monsters. They looked like giant octopuses. Shun Tu Gong immediately recognized that they were the biological weapons of the 9 States team during the battle at the Great Pyramid of Giza. Their tentacles had been modified and embedded with mechanical parts. The moment they appeared, the Gatling guns started firing at Imodin and the others. The chain of fire formed by the storm of bullets destroyed everything in its path. There were not many things that were faster than bullets. However, there happened to be one thing beside Imodin: eyes that were faster than bullets. When the mysterious woman, Menes, turned her eyes to the octopus monsters, the chain of fire that bloomed in the flames from the muzzles disappeared from the world just like that. Then, the Gatling guns themselves, then the tentacles, and finally the vampire octopus itself. Everything that followed his gaze disappeared silently, like an illusion. They disappeared from Shun Tu Gong's sight without a trace of smoke. Looking at all this, Shun Tu Gong felt his hair stand on end. In the face of such an unreasonable ability, no matter how powerful they were, they could not withstand a single blow. How could he not see that the team formed by the 5 octopus monsters could almost perish together with the Yama team? However, in the face of such a real monster, they could not even delay Imodin for a second. In order to cover up his loss of composure, Shun Tu Gong pretended to go forward to check. He took a quick glance and said, "They should have waded through the water. Only this kind of monster can swim upstream at such a fast speed and catch up to us." Imodin did not pay attention to this. Other than Chenong, the other enemies did not deserve his attention. 200 to 300 meters away, under the illumination of the sun, a row of golden sculptures of ferocious beasts could be seen clearly. The carvings on them were the symbols of Anubis, jackals. Behind this row of sculptures was a towering pyramid. Facing Imhotep, a gap revealed the appearance of a temple within the pyramid. Chapter 689. After entering the pyramid, Imodin had no doubts that the flames in the temple at the bottom level were already burning, illuminating the temple in a dazzling golden light. At the bottom of the long stairs was a picture of a scorpion with wings, and on both sides were the squatting pictures of Anubis's jackal head. Right in front of Imodin, There were some golden sacrificial tools, and on top of the god's throne was the symbol of a scorpion cast in gold. Imodin sneered as he looked at the things left behind by the demon scorpion emperor. He coldly said, "No wonder that idiot was refined into a demon by Anubis." He compared himself to the gods, but he forgot that he was just a useless chess piece, a failure. If not for Anubis's pity, he wouldn't even have the chance to show his brutality. He would have died in the hands of those barbarians who invaded Egypt. Menes had already closed her eyes, but she seemed to be able to see everything in front of her. She had a complicated feeling towards Anubis. There was fear, there was hatred, anger, and a hint of undetectable reverence. Unlike the other three abominations, Menes had an appearance that was very similar to a normal person. As long as she did not open her eyes, she was no different from the Son of God. She did not have the experience of Cassicamwe and Sekimib, nor was she filled with anger like them. She did not have an unforgettable hatred towards the gods. She did not even have the faceless woman, Sekimib, who had suffered and been tortured. Her hatred towards the gods was far less than the others. Therefore, she still had a hint of reverence. As for the shadow of the universe, Cassicamwe, and the mist of original sin, Sekimib, he was born like a monster. Sekimib was born with corrosive black fog. When he was still an embryo, he carried that strange black fog with him. This black fog seemed to have come from the underworld. It would corrode a person's flesh and blood and contaminate a person's soul according to a person's sin or karma. This would continue until the host turned into a black fog like him, becoming an abomination of karma. When Sekimibu was still an embryo, his ability was not strong. However, even a pregnant woman like this could not withstand 10 months of erosion and torture. When she discovered that she had been tortured by nightmares and her body was rotting, she realized that the fetus in her womb was a veritable unfilial child of God. But out of motherly love, this woman endured all the torture and wanted to give birth to this child who was called a descendant of God, but was actually a divine sin. Because of this, his mother went to beg Imodin, who was not the high priest at that time, but was already in a high position because of his noble bloodline. She begged him to protect her child from being offered to the gods and sacrificed on the altar after he was born. This woman couldn't hide it for long. Soon, she was discovered by the priest. According to the oracle, these children of God would be imprisoned and then offered as a blood sacrifice to the gods, becoming their favorite sacrifices. Therefore, this woman didn't even have the chance to commit suicide. As the fetus grew, the power of the black fog became stronger and stronger. In the end, when his mother was on her last breath, Sekimibu finally broke through his mother's rotting abdomen and crawled out of her flesh, taking away the last bit of life of this tortured woman. At the moment when this woman, who was absolutely great to her child, died, Sekimibu, who was born naked into this world, carried a sin that could not be redeemed in his entire life. In an instant, he was devoured by the black fog of karmic distortion, a healthy baby's flesh and blood. He became a few dry bones contained in the black fog. At that moment, his power also experienced a qualitative change, and he devoured all the flesh and blood in the entire high priest palace. Imodin was the first to arrive at the place where the tragedy happened. He saw the black fog crying on the black soil where his mother had rotted. Because of this woman's previous request, Imodin hid the truth of Sekimibu's existence. He told the high priest that the children of God had been destroyed because they couldn't bear the sin of his birth, and he adopted him by his side. That was why Sekimibu was named the Fog of Original Sin. This was because he carried the sin of killing his mother from birth. He was born because of love, and he was sinful because of his birth. Because of the sin of killing his mother, while the black fog became his ever-victorious weapon, it also hurt him even more cruelly. As for the shadow of the universe, Cassicamwe, Chun-Ong had long since seen through his essence. He had used the time anomaly to describe his characteristics. His external manifestation was distorted light, shadow, and space. The reason for this was that only these three manifestations, which had no mass, could appear through time interference. Chunong had once said that time was a manifestation of a higher dimension. His vivid description was that the higher dimension of life was like a worm that spread infinitely across the timeline. While such an existence peaked at time, it would constantly suffer the backlash of time, which was nothing more than a feather to those higher dimensional beings. But to Sekimibu, such a backlash was unbearable. Unlike normal life, Sekimibu, who was born due to a miracle that could not be replicated, did not have a present. Humans were creatures with a past, present, and future, and every human was a present existence at a certain point in time. But Sekimibu was an existence that contained all past, present, and future at any given point in time. Due to this state of existence that was even more at odds with the essence of the world, the moment Cassicumwill's servant was born, his physical body was obliterated by the backlash of time. Any physical existence was completely obliterated, and only an essence that transcended this backlash could survive this obliteration. And Cassicumwill just happened to possess an essence that transcended time, divinity. Divinity distorted light, shadow, and space, and it was the essence of this temporal anomaly that allowed Sekimibu to survive. It also allowed him to become a strange state that was between a higher dimensional being and a human. Therefore, the space around him would appear in a state of time fog, which was a conflict between his essence of existence and time. It was an error created within the range of his interference. That was why he was able to reveal the existence of Shintagong when he was 6 years old. This was because under his interference, Shintagong's existence had a temporary error, and the scar left by the faceless woman in his past had changed Shintagong's present. Within the range of Sekimibu's interference, he possessed a sense that transcended his own dimension. This sense was based on time, which meant that he could sense an existence's past and future, and could even interfere with the existence's past and future. In the 1920 temple, he had seen the temple from 250 years ago and left a scar on the statue. Then, the 1920 temple statue would have a scar from 250 years ago. Chapter 690. These chilling abilities were the embodiment of the transcendental essence of the gods inherited by the abominations. Compared to the gods who were limited by the rules, the gods' abilities were even more illegal and terrifying. That was why the gods desired their divinity, but were also afraid of the power of these abominations of God. The gods had a much larger essence compared to them, but because of this, they were also greatly restricted. They could not necessarily form their own essence of the rules. Heaven and earth were united, but heroes were not free. The gods had everything: power, immortality, strength, nobility, and immortality, but freedom was not included. Imodin now knew this very well. He looked at the floor in front of him, which was inlaid with the Scorpio pattern, and the two squatting statues of Anubis beside him. He could clearly see the endless, surging divine power behind the two statues and the Scorpio pattern. He could read the meaning of the divine power. Divine power was the eyes of God. All right, in some technological systems of the universe, the research on the gods had led scientists to believe that the essence of the gods was the source of abnormal information disturbances. Therefore, the manifestation of the gods' power and divine authority was concentrated on the concept and the true name. And in this theory, divine power was the information disturbances emitted by the gods themselves. Imodin did not understand these theories that only Chunong would study, but he knew that divine power could be interpreted as the words of God. He was now reading Anubis' message word by word. Those who step into this place will be deprived of all glory. Anubis, do you want to take away the glory from me and let me face the challenge as a mortal? Imodin sighed. Unfortunately, I am no longer such a small existence that is tainted by your glory. I am fire, the source of light. I have been ignited, and I can emit endless glory. This glory is not something you can take away, because it is something that belongs to me. As Imodin said this, he stepped into the range of the words of God. A trace of fear appeared on Mini's face, and he subconsciously took a step back. But the other three followed Imodin into the words of Anubis. Only Shun Tu Gong accompanied her, not getting involved in the muddy waters of Immoden and Anubis. The statues on both sides emitted a light that only the immortals could see, and with the divine power of Anubis, they whistled towards Immoden. A trace of the flame appeared in Immoden's body. Compared to Anubis, it was still weak, but in essence, it was not inferior. The flame emitted the same immortal glory, allowing Immoden to hold his head high as he walked through Anubis' prohibition. At this moment, the pyramid seemed to tremble, as if the anger of Anubis was shaking the place. But Immoden had completely looked down on him. He came in front of the stone statue that sealed the magic Scorpion Emperor, and with a sneer, threw the death bracelet into the round hole in the stone statue. In the violent trembling, the magic Scorpion Emperor broke out of the seal and pushed open the stone door that sealed him. Anubis's Death Guard army also appeared in large numbers in the forest of the Amai's oasis and in the nearby desert along with the Black Tide. They roared and searched for traces of Chun Ong and the others. But the airship had already left the entrance of the Amai's oasis, and there was no trace of Chun Ong and the reincarnators in the swamp forest. They could only roar and rush out of the desert, carrying out the will of Anubis, bringing slaughter and conquest to the whole world. With the loud sound of stone doors sliding, a huge shadow appeared in front of Shun Tu Gong and the others. The upper body of the magic Scorpion Emperor was the image of a dignified and tyrannical man. It should be the Scorpion King who controlled the Death Army to conquer Egypt thousands of years ago. The muscles on his body bulged and were covered with burn scars. His two forearms had already transformed into huge scorpion pincers. His lower body was the image of the lower half of a scorpion, with a cold, barbed stinger standing upright behind him. His entire body was like a demon that had crawled out of the underworld. After the magic Scorpion Emperor broke the seal, the first thing he saw was Immoden standing not far in front of him. Menes and the others stood behind Immoden, while Shun Tu Gong and Hafs were even further behind. Therefore, the magic Scorpion Emperor did not need to think too much to know that the key was the bald man at the front. The corner of his mouth revealed a bloodthirsty smile. With two huge pincers, the limbs of his lower body crawled quickly and came in front of Immoden. He looked at him with a bloodthirsty gaze, but what surprised and angered him was that the prey standing in front of him did not show any fear or resistance. Instead, it looked at him calmly. Such doubts could not stop him from killing the man in front of him. However, Immoden finally sighed and said, "If I kill you, will I be able to control the entire Death Army?" The magic Scorpion Emperor's voice sounded like a roar coming from his throat. "Then let's see who kills who." Then he raised his huge pincer and stabbed it towards Immoden's heart. But very quickly, he was fortunate enough to see Imhotep's true appearance. Imhotep's body was burning with demonic flames, and his claw-like hand was pressed against the magic Scorpion Emperor's face. The burning flames of vengeance made the magic Scorpion Emperor feel as if his soul was burning. He was like a scorpion that had its claws and fangs pinched and was being swung around by Imhotep. Immoden roared, "Is that all you've got? Didn't Anubis give you more power?" Then he smiled and tore the magic Scorpion Emperor's 4 pincers from his body. Like a naughty child, he tore the magic Scorpion Emperor's body into pieces. The magic Scorpion Emperor, who had not been pierced in the heart by the spear of judgment, was still alive. He wailed and struggled on the ground. His torn limbs were still moving reflexively. The scene was too horrible to look at. Although Shun Tu Gong already knew that Immoden was sick and powerful, it still felt surreal to see him abuse the final boss of the second plot. He whispered to the magic Scorpion Emperor in his heart, "The one standing in front of you is not the original Immoden who was addicted to love and was even a little weak. A psychopath trained him to be extremely powerful, making him cruel, heartless, tyrannical, and terrifying. He's also many times stronger than before. You might not know how powerful Immoden is after waking up from love. He's simply sick." In the end, Immoden crushed the magic Scorpion Emperor's skull with one hand. It was unknown whether Anubis could not bear to see the magic Scorpion Emperor endure such torture, or whether he wanted to get to the main show as soon as possible, but he finally took the magic Scorpion Emperor's life. At this time, the control of the Death God army was finally in Immoden's hands. He could already command this army to conquer the world. If it was in the plot world of other reincarnators, this would be a great victory for Immoden. The reincarnation team on Immoden's side would receive a shocking reward. Then, when the plot to fight against Immoden's Death God army started, more reincarnators would be sent in. However, in this world where Chunong had descended, this was just a casual move by Immoden. It was an inconspicuous step on his path, and the plot that started because of this was truly terrifying. As Shun Tu Gong checked the arrival of the King God, he watched as Immoden abandoned the control of the Death God army like it was trash. He said to Anubis, "At this point, you still want to use such useless things to tie up my energy? What are you still praying for? Are you still fantasizing about me? Then I'll completely destroy this fantasy now." Remember, Anubis, this is just the beginning, far from the end. As Immoden walked along the passage he had come in, the Amzi oasis had already begun to collapse. A huge vortex appeared behind Immoden, and countless plants in the space of the Amzi oasis collapsed towards this vortex. The entire space went from being a physical space to collapsing into a bottomless, abyss-like world. In the huge crack that had opened up, fiery red magma released heat. However, the countless arms and struggling figures on both sides of the crack reminded everyone that this was not a crack that led to Earth, but another world. The world where the tortured souls were, Anubis's divine kingdom, the space known as the underworld. Immoden came to the edge of the crack and looked at the purgatory-like scene inside, revealing a sincere smile. It was as if this was what he had been searching for, and the Amzi oasis was just its entrance. As he approached, the struggling figures with their arms outstretched looked as if they had seen something terrifying. They panicked and wanted to escape from Immoden's direction, but their lower bodies had already merged with this world, so they could only wail in vain. Chapter 691. Duan Wenhua jumped up from the marble floor the moment he woke up. He calmly glanced around and confirmed that he was in an unfamiliar hall with the corner of his eyes. There were also a few people of different ages and genders fainted beside him. Kidnapping. Duan Wenhua ruled out this possibility immediately, because he was sure that he was underground. Judging from the structure of the building hall, it was a nuclear engineering level facility. It was too extravagant to use an underground building of this level to accommodate a worthless commoner like him. Moreover, since it was a kidnapping, they would not allow him to wake up without any precautionary measures. At this moment, he heard a female voice behind him. "Not bad. You're the most cultured among this batch of newcomers." Duan Wenhua turned around and saw a woman with a hot figure playing with an exaggerated and crude handgun. It looked simple and crude, a strong contrast to the woman's exquisite gentleness. He greeted him at the same time. "According to the tradition of the reincarnators, I must say this first." The woman smiled and said, "Although at this point, physical fitness is no longer of any use in God's space. In this realistic capitalist society, everyone only cares about points, points, and points. With points, even a pig can become stronger. Ever since Dr. Chun Ang's genius controlled and developed the plot world in the form of a real-world organization and revealed part of the operating nature of God's realm, money worship and the torrent of capital have reshaped this distorted society. We traded with the Lord God and connected the market to the Lord God. The explosion of technology and the advancement of management technology have caused the rules of this realm to change dramatically." The woman smiled. "Of course, for a newbie like you who has just joined the realm, these things are still unfamiliar. Let me ask you now, do you know the origin of the first sentence I said?" Duan Wenhua let his brain take a moment to completely wake up from the dizziness. At the same time, he quickly processed the large amount of information the woman said. After a while, when the people next to him woke up one after another, he said, "Isn't it infinite horror? Who hasn't seen it?" "Very good. This saved me a lot of trouble." The woman praised. "My name is Winston, and I'm your guide. First, empty your mind and focus on thinking about God. He has already put most of the content into your mind. For those who don't understand the situation, ask someone who knows where this is to explain it to them. Duan Wenhua had already accepted the unfamiliar information that was inserted into his brain, but soon more information surged in. Survival and competition. This game has a long history. There were countless worlds that cycled through the river of time, operating according to a predetermined fate. We, the Samsara Travelers, were the players of this game, the game system, the playthings in the hands of a great being known as the main god. We relied on breaking this predetermined cycle of fate to gradually become powerful and complete. But everything came to an end in the last era. The omnipotent main god, as well as the wheel of the endless world that made up this game, were finally broken. In this complex and huge system, a virus was born. The core god's throne was shattered, and the entire system was on the verge of collapse because of the terrible existence known as the Republic, and because of the virus known as civilization. The main god collapsed, and the wheel of the world fell from the sky. The plot worlds that repeated the predetermined fate of the plot ushered in liberation and revolution. The existence known as plot quests and NPCs opened the world bridge, spreading free will across the 3,000 worlds. The seeds of revolution were thus born, and the will of freedom sprouted. With the help of civilization and war, the internal systems and knowledge of countless plot worlds were nurtured. In the war against the main god and the Samsara Travelers, the civilizations of countless plot worlds united, establishing a resistance organization known as the Sea of Civilizations, and began the long and tragic war between the new era and the main god space. The failure of the main god also contributed to the self-liberation of the Samsara Travelers. In the last era, the leadership force headed by Dr. Chun Ong led the Samsara Travelers to save all the Samsara Travelers from the status of the main god's puppets and toys. They broke some of the internal rules of the main god, and finally achieved the establishment of new rules. The Samsara Travelers and the main god signed a new contract. Appendix: The Covenant of Man and God. Samsara Travelers Basic Edition. This is the new era. God's calendar, year 15 of the new era. Do you understand now? Winston said impatiently. She glanced at her watch and suddenly smiled. The guide's salary of 500 points has been received. Please give my explanation a rating on the personal terminal on your right hand. If it's not a 5-star rating, you're done for. Listen to me. It's not a good start to offend a veteran in the first mission. Hearing such a blatant threat from Winston, all the rookies trembled and clicked a very satisfied rating on the personal terminal on their right hand. Only Duan Wenhua stared at his watch in a daze. When Winston's impatience showed, a young female college student next to him whispered, "Hurry up. The guide seems to be a little impatient." At this time, another man with dyed yellow hair shouted anxiously at Duan Wenhua, "Hurry up if you want to give an evaluation. Do you want us to be punished together?" After saying that, he even smiled at Winston. This street gangster's ability to read people's expressions was not bad. He did not follow the script at all. Instead, his knees were as soft as noodles. Duan Wenhua was surprised. "You believed her just because she said that?" "I was just looking at the attached Human God Treaty Basic Edition." Chapter 6 clearly states that all guides are not allowed to participate in rookie missions, not allowed to have financial contact with rookies before the completion of the first mission, not allowed to kill, harm, or deliberately deceive rookies. The guide has to explain the key issues in the guide mission remarks, including the legal system and rules of the Samsara dimension, the situation of the major companies, and the preliminary understanding of the current rookie mission world. After the guide guides the rookies to complete the preliminary understanding and contact with the Lord God, they will receive 500 basic points. Depending on the evaluation of the rookies, they will receive a maximum of 1,000 and a minimum of 100 reward points. Duan Wenhua looked up and said, "In other words, Miss Guide, your work has not been completed. According to the Rookie Protection, I have the right to file a lawsuit with the Lord God Reincarnated Service Company. This way, you may only receive the lowest reward points, so I think it's best that you tell us what we should know." Hearing this, Winston held his forehead and said, "Damn it. Who told me that rookies are easy to deceive? You're going to waste my whole morning again. Time is points." The previous rookies were clearly scared off. Why is it that when it's my turn, there's a troublesome kid like you? Fine. Seeing that 1,000 points is my basic salary for half a month. Winston took out a tablet computer from his personal space, pulled up a full tee of documents, and handed them to Duan Wenhua. "This is most of the basic information about the Lord God since the new era. Give me a good review after you read it, or I'll remember you, kid." Duan Wenhua took a look. The dense list of contents was dazzling. He directly clicked on the relevant information that he was most concerned about. Human God Treaty, 9-star Demigod Edition. Human God Treaty, 10-star True God Edition. Lord God Enterprise Management System. Lord God Reincarnator Service Company. Lord God Reincarnator Service Company. Lord God Reincarnator Labor Contract. Lord God Reincarnator Labor Protection Law. Lord God Reincarnator Public Security Management Regulations. Lord God Reincarnator World Public Security Management Regulations. Chapter 692. As Imodin jumped in, the crack leading to the underworld opened up again like an eye. The distance that one person could cross had expanded by several times. The huge crack was like an open eye, staring at the people at the edge. Without hesitation, Kasaikamwi, Sekamibu, and Seymour followed Imodin and jumped into the crack. Shintagong and Meanies hesitated for a moment before following them into the underworld. Countless distorted figures struggled at the edge of the underworld. They had no faces and did not even have any intelligence. They could only instinctively grab onto any living thing and drag them down into the depths of the underworld. However, Imodin did not let them do it. Instead, he walked step by step towards the depths of the underworld. He knew that these distorted figures were the shadows of the souls that had entered the underworld to be judged. They were endless, born and extinguished as they came. Sekamibu, the shadow of cardinal sins, caught up from behind. He took off his black robe, revealing a body that looked like a bound black fog. Countless wisps of black fog that seemed to have life and were bound to a humanoid body. From time to time, a black fog that looked like a head would try to break free from his bindings. The skull-like head would open its mouth and roar soundlessly, struggling in extreme pain. Sekamibu knelt on the ground of the underworld. Imodin placed his hand on the top of Sekamibu's head. After a moment of silence, he said, "Sekamibu, do you see that? The shadows of those souls. After a soul is judged by Osiris here, if he is lighter than a feather, he will enter Eru, the paradise ruled by Osiris. At the same time, he will leave a shadow here that represents his sins, because Eru is a sinless kingdom. If he is heavier than a feather, his heart will fall into the mouth of the crocodile-headed and lion-bodied monster, Amat. But Osiris has gone far away, and Anubis has replaced him to rule this kingdom of the dead. The underworld still exists, but the souls of mortals are completely free. No mortal soul will ever come here again. The era of the gods has entered its twilight, and only a pile of decaying corpses are left, still struggling. Let them be free from their bindings and pain." After a moment of silence, Imodin said to Sekiai Mibu. He turned around and looked at the countless wriggling shadows. Then, he resolutely turned his head and moved forward. Hearing Imodin's order, Sea Campbell stayed where he was. He raised his head and released the black mist that he had been suppressing. Thick mist seeped out of his facial features, and a skull of black mist escaped from his body. Wisps of black mist landed on the distorted soul shadows and instantly corroded them. Imodin arrived in front of a huge hall in the underworld. He followed the souls of the great old ones into the long corridor of Anubis's Hall of Judgment and came to a huge statue of a jackal's head. This statue of Anubis held the Book of the Dead in one hand and stretched out the other. A balance made of gold was placed on his outstretched hand. Using that hand as a fulcrum, there was a tray with a white feather on it, and the other tray was empty. A voice that seemed to overlap with the voices of countless people resounded in the hall. "Imodin, my high priest, are you here to offer your soul and flesh to me?" The eyes of the statue slowly opened. At this moment, the last god of death, Anubis, who represented death and judgment, had finally awakened and appeared in front of Imodin. He was no longer a vague will that Chonong had pierced through with the spear of judgment. Instead, he had descended in a brand new and complete form in front of Imodin, completing this fateful duel. Unlike the gods of other worlds, Anubis did not have a divine body like a mortal. He was like a vast and magnificent will that hovered above the hall. The balance of death that symbolized fairness was him, and a monster with the head of a crocodile and the body of a lion was also a part of him. The essence of a god was beyond the limits of a mortal's imagination. The part of him that appeared in front of Imodin that could be understood by the world would always be a part of a huge iceberg that was exposed to the surface of the water. Imodin found that he still could not fully understand the power of the gods. If he could not understand, he could not hurt them. If he could only destroy the superficial existence that he could understand, then he might be able to win for a while in this fateful duel, but in the end, he would lose completely. But Imodin still replied with a smile, "No, Anubis. I am here to send you into the dusk. The gods will enter the dusk, but they are immortal after all. Their glory will never be extinguished. Dusk is not death, my high priest. We are only in a temporary slumber." Anubis said slowly, "Imodin, your wisdom is as deep as the sea among mortals, but to a god, you are still too young and immature. The soul of a mortal makes it impossible for you to understand the way the ancients think." Imodin sighed and said, "Perhaps. Once upon a time, I deeply understood the difference between mortals and gods. This made me disheartened, and love blinded my eyes, making me weak and slow. I knew that the gods had decided my fate, and that everything about me was under your control, but I was powerless to resist because I was foolish and fearful. Just like when I saw a tattoo that represented the pharaoh's guard on the arm of a mortal, and not an Egyptian, an ignorant woman who possessed the soul of the pharaoh's daughter, Nina, I knew that I could not escape from the gods' control because I was weak and ignorant, and I had many mortal weaknesses, the most dangerous of which was love. Mortals do not deserve love. Anubis, our souls are beyond our control. Our fates are at the mercy of others. Before we lose our freedom, the greatest part of our souls, the part that transcends the gods, love, will only become our shackles, binding us and forcing us to sink into oblivion." Imhotep silently closed his eyes, letting the last of his tears slide down his cheeks. At that moment, love became the shackles of fate, causing me to slide step by step in the direction that you set, until it was cut off by someone. Mortals, could it be that only by destroying the thing that you cherish the most can you see the shackles behind it? Imodin said coldly, "So I was killed with the shackles, but a new will was born on the remains of my body. I came before you, Anubis, not to take revenge on you, because the gods do not deserve revenge for me, but to completely obtain freedom, to master the power of revenge. Pitiful mortals, although you possess the immortal radiance, your soul is still just an ordinary object that has been tainted by this radiance. Mortals are powerless to resist the gods." Anubis sighed, and suddenly, a beating heart appeared on the scale in his hand. Imodin smiled as he looked at the organ that came from his body, falling on the scale that represented the judgment of death. Imodin, the gap between life and death was the hardest to cross. As long as it was a dead existence, in front of Anubis, there was no power to resist, because the essence of the existence of the god of death was to judge and settle the dead souls. As long as you have no way to break through the barrier between life and death, you are still a dead existence, and on the scale of the god of death, there will always be a heart for you. As long as the scale falls, and you are condemned, then Anubis can easily swallow your heart. Before becoming a god, there will always be death and life. Only a true god can transcend death. Even if you have ignited the divine fire, you are still just a demigod dead soul. Chunang's voice seemed to come into his ears. Anubis watched as Imodin's heart rose and fell on the scale. But the strange thing was, no matter what, the scale could not calm down. It was clearly close to tilting and stabilizing with a feather on one end, but soon the balance was broken. Anubis looked deeply at the scale in his hand and suddenly said angrily, "Mortal, you dare to deceive death?" He grabbed towards the heart on the scale, but this rash action instantly broke the balance of the scale. Imodin's heart beat fiercely and silently disappeared from the scale, returning to Imodin's chest. Imodin felt the dark scripture of the dead in his arms brighten, and a line of words appeared on the title page. The power of the dark scripture of the dead transcended time, like a layer of fog, covering the image of Imodin being gnawed on by the scarabs in the stone coffin. When the god of death, Anubis, turned back time and opened the stone coffin, there was no corpse of Imodin at all, only a cloud of fog that he could not see clearly, and everything was hidden behind the fog. Even the god of death could not understand this kind of existence, nor could he see through the layer of fog to determine the state of Imodin. He could not determine Imodin's death, so he was in the state of Imodin. In the judgment of the essence of the gods, he could be a dead soul, or he could be alive. This contradictory superposition caused Imodin to break away from the essence of a dead soul, becoming a quantum superposition, a state of being dead and alive at the same time. Divine power could not observe Imodin's death, so the god of death could not judge him. Chapter 693. The enraged Anubis stared at the black scripture of the dead in front of Imodin's chest. He sensed that this divine weapon that he had bestowed upon Imodin was shrouded in a trace of power that was not very strong, but was very mysterious. It was this power that protected Imodin, allowing him to temporarily escape from his identity as a dead spirit that was greatly restrained by him. This power made Anubis feel a trace of fear. As his clone, the crocodile-headed lion monster, Amat, knew that he could no longer wait for the heart that had been taken away from him due to obedience to his priesthood, so he pounced from the side. At this time, Menes Kasaikamwe and the others finally had the time to block Imodin. Abominations were born with divinity, and they did not exist in the state of death or dead spirits. Even though they had been imprisoned in the underworld, they were not restrained by Anubis. Monster Amat pounced from the top of the palace. For countless years, the hearts of the sinners who had been judged in the palace of the underworld beat together with him. Amat had the head of a crocodile and the body of a lion. In essence, he represented the divine power of two gods. One was the crocodile totem of Seth, the Lord of Power, and the other was the incarnation of Ra, the god of sunset, Adam. He also had the incarnation of a lion. In Egyptian mythology, the god of the sun, Ra, would ride the ship of the sun to patrol the underworld after sunset. Therefore, Anubis's incarnation, Adam, had the divine power of the sun after sunset and the withering power of Seth. As the incarnation of Anubis's priesthood of judgment, he had the ability to punish sinners and restrain the dead spirits. At this moment, the sins of the souls of Egypt that had been thrown into the underworld for thousands of years burst forth. The hearts of countless sinners that had been devoured by Adam beat wildly, providing him with endless divine power. At this moment, the power of these sinful souls turned into endless curses. Accompanied by the radiance of Adam, it stabbed out with an unimaginable strike. The power of this strike was unparalleled. In terms of quantity, it had accumulated the wrath of the sinful souls that Anubis had accumulated for thousands of years. The resentment of the sinners whose hearts had been devoured by Adam had instead turned into his power. Together with the priesthood of judgment, he locked onto Imodin as his enemy and judged his soul. The ingenuity of divine power lay in its extraordinary qualities. Meanwhile, Anubis's divine power manifested through the divine order of judgment, which was directed at Imodin's soul, transcending the material realm of judgment. If Chenong were to analyze it, it would be a karmic strike that gathered the power of information interference. For Anubis, it was an extraordinary divine power. However, to Chenong, it perfectly embodied the essence of divine power and information interference. The souls of mortals were the same as divine power, possessing the power to disturb information. Anubis used the souls of sinners that he had accumulated for thousands of years as the source of information disturbance. Through the information interference method of divine power, he launched a karmic attack on Imidin. This kind of causality weapon naturally had the ability to alter reality. As for the causality weapon used by Anubis's judgment clone, it was nothing more than an attack with the concepts of judgment, soul, and sin. Its effect was nothing more than to judge the sins of Imidin's soul and obtain the right to judge and control his soul. The karmic target was the concept of judgment between sin and punishment. In the face of such an attack based on the essence of divinity, any resistance that did not possess extraordinary divine power, in other words, information manipulation, was futile. Imhotep's own soul was not a blank piece of paper. It was pure and flawless. In fact, regardless of whether it was the evil act of killing the pharaoh or cursing Cairo, they were all unforgivable crimes in ancient Egypt. If sinners were ranked, then Imhotep's soul should be the most heinous. In the face of such a direct attack on karma, he could not resist at all. But as the high priest of Anubis, how could Imidin not understand this? The sins of mortals are judged by you. Then who will judge your sins? One of Imidin's trump cards was finally used. Sekhet, densely shroud of original sin, faced Anubis's soul judgment directly. Beneath his billowing black robes was a remnant of a body whose rotten bones had been completely corroded. He faced the monster AMT that Anubis had turned into, his eyes showing extreme hatred and enmity as he unleashed a roar that had been suppressed for 2,500 years at the gods with the most resolute will. If the basis of Monster Amter's information interference was judgment, then the essence of Sekhet, the unfilial child of God who was born with the black shroud of information interference, was sin, and sin was the basis of judgment. Through the shroud of original sin, Sekhet briefly carried Imhotep's sin onto his own body, and then faced Monster Amter's judgment. Unlike other attacks on information, as the essence and important characteristic of divine power, concepts, rituals, and symbolism were very important. To take an example of information attacks in low-latitude worlds for humans, if the network was a universe, IDs would be the icebergs that the gods revealed above the surface of the sea. The gods were the humans behind the network, and the essence that they revealed to the world was their IDs. Extraordinary divine power was like two hackers attacking each other. They used the essence of the world they understood to attack the enemy on the information plane, and the essence was information interference and disturbance. In that process, information itself was of great significance, with rules like various protocols and network rules, while rituals, symbols, and concepts were equivalent to the information flow sent out by IDs. Those information flow used rules to interfere with the enemy's information. At present, ID Anubis was using AMT the chicken to unleash the judgment virus on ID Imidin, directly retrieving information from the soul databank to destroy and disturb it. The loophole it used was the sin loophole in the soul databank, and the user ID Sekhet densely shroud was proficient in the sin loophole that led to the soul databank. He had locked down ID Imidin's sin loophole and chained away the virus invaded ID Anubis's sin loophole. However, Anubis had the perfect firewall known as divinity and his identity as a divine network administrator, which made the attack ineffective. That was why he boasted shamelessly, "How can a mortal judge the gods?" Anubis's voice was cold and emotionless. The internet super administrator Chenong, the ultimate authority holder, was observing and recording everything that happened on this local network, while the local network's land administrator, the Lord, was observing and recording everything that happened. The super administrator Chun Ang's ID Chunong, Professor Chun, was using the imaginary Space Burrell conversion protocol to hide his own data, ready to log into the address mansion of the dead at any time. To others, including Imidin, this was a solemn, god-slaying war, a rebellion against fate. However, in the eyes of Chenong, it was nothing more than an information battle between the ID Imidin, who was in the process of obtaining administrator rights, and the ID Sekamibu, ID Minis, ID Kasaikamwe, as well as the external virus, Shun Tu Gong, who was controlled by the land administrator, the Lord, to obtain administrator rights for the ID Anubis. Their opponent was the ID Anubis, a veteran administrator. However, the ID Anubis was nothing more than an account of the Anubis behind the computer. Even if Imidin succeeded in deactivating it and obtained the administrator's identity, it might take some time for Anubis to recover the account, but the Anubis outside the network would not be harmed in any way. This was the dimensional barrier. The so-called struggle for fate of Imidin and the others was just an attempt to deactivate an account. Of course, Anubis would disappear, but the existence that was controlling Anubis would only temporarily leave this world. It could even come back at any time, restore the account, or register a new account. The true control would always be in the hands of those higher dimensional existences. Either the higher-level administrator, the Lord, would block the IP of Anubis, or the super administrator, Chenong, would kill the owner of the Anubis account in the real world above the network. The veil was lifted, and the truth of the world revealed a deathly pale coldness. When the ID Sekamibu, fog of original sin, S-Soul database was blocked by the sinful loophole, the ID Meanies, Eye of Infinity, used the information deletion tool to attack the ID Anubis's database. However, the low-level information deletion tool could only delete part of the information when the ID Meanies had level 2 administrator rights, and throw it into the virtual space trash can. Chapter 694. The Battle of Divinity was a battle of authority. The 4 abominations standing on Imidin's side were all old monsters who had experienced many battles. Compared to reincarnated humans, each of them had the pinnacle of control and development of their abilities. They had developed techniques based on the essence of sin, time, illusory space, and unreadable to their very limits. Shintu Gong trembled as he watched from the sidelines. Their incredible control over their abilities, as well as their various strange and wondrous attacks, made him deeply understand that the power they had previously displayed was probably only a tenth of their true power. Sekai's dense mist of original sin wandered around his body like an arrow. The soul of any living being could be interpreted as a special stream of information. This stream of information was extremely encrypted, and its core was a black box formula of the final variable. Under the condition that the dependent variable of the formula changed, a part of the special solution was obtained, which could be called the 7 emotions and 6 desires. And the special solution to the soul formula, the 7 emotions and 6 desires, would ultimately interfere with the objective world's information. The negative part was sin, which was also known as karma in the Eastern magic system. Using the soul's desire to interfere with reality to create karma was a relatively complete information interference process. Using the karma of reality to interfere with the target's soul's desire, which would then affect the target's intrinsic soul. This was Sekai's technique. In other words, it was a reverse invasion using the shallow information in the soul database to interfere with external data channels. Shintu Gong finally witnessed how terrifying such an ability could be. Wherever Sekai's dense black mist went, the world of hell would completely distort into a completely different appearance. The glorious palaces were distorted by the black mist corrosion into a bloody and filthy hell. The souls that Anubis clone Amut had devoured before broke out of Amut's abdomen, with countless hands breaking out of Amut's abdomen and reaching out. Shintu Gong had only been touched by a trace of the black mist shadow, but he already felt that something was wrong with his own consciousness. The normal world in his eyes slowly faded away, and reality distorted into something indescribable. A part of hell's essence that mortals couldn't see was revealed in an absurd and distorted form in Shintu Gong's eyes. He saw that the surrounding space had turned into countless overlapping lights and shadows. There were large blocks of color and blurry tones everywhere. All matter and existence had been taken out of shape and turned into a superimposed coating. Shintu Gong realized that he was unable to understand or sense what he was seeing. At this moment, An indescribable object in the midst of the blobs of colors suddenly distorted and returned to the appearance of a somewhat delicate and handsome young man. Shin Tu-gong could recognize that this was the appearance of the person in charge of Team 9 States, Professor Chun, as described in the intelligence report. Chenong smiled at him and said, "I was wondering why I sensed an abnormal observer. So it's you." Seeing this, Shin Tu-gong hurriedly asked for help. "May I ask why I became like this? Also, where's this place?" Seeing this, Chun-ong shook his head and sighed. "You haven't left the underworld at all. In fact, you haven't even left the battlefield between Imidin and Anubis. Look, those are the two sides testing each other." Shin Tu-gong took a closer look and only felt that it was a blob of constantly changing colors. He could not see anything else. Chenong explained to him, "You have just been contaminated by the black fog of sin. This special authority can search for the information interference you have caused to the objective world and reverse invade your soul." The soul is a conceptual term that includes memory databases, emotions, feelings, perception, cognition, and so on. It is a general summary of the information variables of intelligent life. Generally speaking, the function of the black fog of sin is to lock onto your soul perception system and completely take over your perception methods, including vision, hearing, and feelings. By controlling the input of information from the outside world, it will distort your soul and mood, including contaminating your emotional system and memory system. Finally, it will contaminate your entire soul and distort your information interference. But because Sekai Mibu has determined that you are an ally, it has restrained its influence on you. As a result, your perception is not contaminated, but there is an error in your cognitive system. Shin Tu-gong looked at the chaotic and messy world around him and was at a loss. Chenong had no choice but to give him an example. "Do you know that in the real world, there is a disease called dyslexia? For us, words are something that can be easily understood, but for people with dyslexia, words are just a kind of irregular and chaotic pattern. They can't read, and their cognitive function is impaired, so they can't understand the information. Your symptoms are very similar to this situation. Unlike dyslexia, the original sins have damaged your perception of shapes, so you're unable to understand the sense of space and flatness. Everything you perceive has no sense of space, and even no shape. And I only discovered your problem after I realized that the observer did not correctly understand the information of my existence." Chenong smiled and said, "So I bypassed your perception of space and shape and directly projected my concept into your perception, allowing you to correctly understand yourself." Shin Tu-gong sighed and said, "It's really a terrifying ability. If that's the case, I don't have the ability to resist at all. It should be very dangerous." However, Chenong did not agree. Although your sense of space and perception of shapes have been damaged, your direct and martial will as a martial artist is still present. This godlike ability will allow you to maintain the lowest level of vigilance. Sekai's black fog has the ability to affect a person's soul directly. The first stage is to control a person's perception, completely controlling your five senses and even your sixth sense. Everything you see, smell, and feel are all illusions created by him. This situation is sufficient to completely control a person. The second stage is to control a person's cognition. For example, if he destroys your perception of harm, then even if he were to kill you right in front of you, you wouldn't resist. It's because you don't understand harm at all, and your soul's reaction to it will be obstructed. The third stage is to control the soul's desires, or rather, the emotional system. It's easier to corrupt a person's intrinsic quality, and as the corrosion progresses, the essence of your existence will be slowly controlled and distorted by him. That's why it's said that sin is a loophole in the soul's database. Once the soul's database is invaded, your life and death will really be in the hands of others, and you will be at the mercy of others. Shin Tu-gong appeared to be extremely guilty, but Chenong said with great emotions. Chapter 695. Anubis fearlessly displayed the astonishing demeanor of a dog of authority. Under the pincer attack of Sekiembu, Menes, and Kasakamwe, He was completely unaffected and still stood firmly in his original position. The fog of original sin corroded the underworld. The eye of infinity distorted space and devoured matter. The shadow of the universe changed dimensions and caused space-time to distort. The faceless woman was nameless, unknown, and invisible. The reason why abominations were dangerous was because of their power. Their very existence was a bug in the normal programming of the world, an error in the laws of the world. They were like viruses in normal programming, appearing based on the loopholes in the laws of the world. Other than Sekiembu, who Chunong had analyzed just now, the abilities of the remaining three still did not exceed this category. Although Shun Tu Gong and the others viewed these abilities as heaven-defying and unsolvable, at the level of Anubis and Chunong, there was nothing that was truly unsolvable. When Mini's eyes were first born, they were a bottomless black hole. At that time, the Egyptian nobles who had offered her to the sacrificial ceremony believed that her eyes were connected to the lowest level of the underworld. Of course, Chunong had already deciphered the coordinates of that space. It was the imaginary solution of the Boyu equation in advanced space physics. In other words, it was an imaginary space whose spatial attributes were completely different from the displayed world. The imaginary space did not exist behind Mini's eyes. Instead, it was Mini's observation that had collapsed the relative function of the Boyu equation, causing an error in the quadrant of space. This caused the Boyu equation to collapse, causing the matter of the physical world to collapse into the imaginary space. If one did not know anything about the space physics involved in this process, and did not know how to use the principles of modern arcane spells or the principles of ancient simple idealism spells to analyze it, then no matter how powerful one's power was, one would not even look at Minis. In theory, if Minis were to look directly at the sun for a long period of time, the violent collapse of space might even cause the sun to collapse, forming a small black hole. This was a very powerful force that could theoretically destroy a star. Unfortunately, this kind of power was completely based on the simple use of the laws of the world. For Chunong, who had not only studied space physics in depth, but also once developed the technology tree related to imaginary space, it could be considered as showing off one's slight skill in front of an expert. Minis had studied for more than 2,000 years. Although his control over his ability could be considered to be precise, when it came to the scientific essence, he was far behind Chunong. It was to the extent that the Samsara travelers were using Minis' eyes in the virtual space to leisurely watch her, Anubis, fight to the death, but she didn't notice it at all. The essence of Cassicamwil's power was a temporal distortion, which was also an error in the laws of the world's surface. To the normal surface world, all existence was present, but Cassicamwil's past, future, and present was a temporal distortion point, forming a considerable contradiction with the normal time around it. This distortion of Cassicamwil's essence and the world was not harmonious. Within the range of his information interference, it formed the unique power of a divine abomination, allowing him to come into contact with an existence's past, present, and future. In theory, this power was extremely powerful because every existence would have a moment of weakness as well as a moment of death. To be able to kill a powerful enemy when they were weak, or to collapse their existence to death, dusk, or end, could easily wipe out a powerful opponent. However, it just so happened that Anubis was an existence that extended endlessly in the river of time. Fortunately, he didn't have Chun-Ang's terrifying power that was highly unified between past, present, and future, and he still had a period of decline relative to time. However, he hid this weakness of time very well, and it wasn't as if he didn't have any defensive measures. That was why Cassicamwil could only try his best to drag Anubis towards dusk. In fact, it greatly weakened Anubis's divine power. However, this situation couldn't be dragged on for long. The time point of Anubis's peak was projecting its power to the present. If the few of them didn't take advantage of the fact that Cassicamwil dragged Anubis to the end of dusk to complete the god slaying while he was weakened, then Anubis would only become more and more powerful. The last was the faceless woman. Her ability was the most unique, and she couldn't be understood by the present world. She was like a file without a driver installed in the system. The extension was too foreign, and the universe couldn't decipher it. Of course, Sam Kate wasn't that advanced. Most of her existence could be deciphered, but there was a small part where there was an error. That was why no one could see her face clearly, because that part was an error in the analysis of the universe. Sam Kate, the faceless woman's main contribution was playing the role of a shit-stirrer. In Anubis's attack, an attack that used the universe's authority on the information level, she used her unreadable essence to interfere with the operation of authority. It was equivalent to Anubis's program moving an unreadable file, causing internal contradictions and errors in the attack. But Anubis was about to catch her tail. If Anubis found the essence of her soul, which was the address of the soul database, then Anubis might use his authority to delete the erroneous file and completely wipe her out. As Chunong had expected, the situation was slipping in the direction of Imogen's side. The place where Anubis was had been distorted by the collapsed space into a singularity with a strong gravitational force. The stone statue that formed the surface of Anubis was collapsing toward the singularity, but Anubis's voice was still calm and cold. Unfilial son, don't make any more futile struggles. You're just the twisted corpses of a real god. Your power is like a baby to me. This is not a difference in numbers, but a difference in essence. He looked at Menes' pale face and said calmly, You can't even understand my existence, and you still want to banish me to that space? Ignorant arrogance. In the distorted space where Anubis was the origin of all the distortion interference, suddenly came the voice of a man speaking in ancient Egyptian. Imogen, hurry up. I can no longer maintain his twilight's end. He is breaking through my blockade, going upstream, breaking through his own twilight, and moving toward the past when he was at his strongest. Seymour Kate also said, Imogen, our father, Anubis has almost locked onto my existence. He will use his own divine power to completely destroy everything in it. It's almost too late. In the hall of the underworld, the phantom of Anubis suddenly became stronger. He tore apart his own dim twilight shadow and broke away from the decline. His body, which was about the size of an arm, stretched out from the distortion of time. A giant hand that seemed to be made of gold tore apart the dark sky of the underworld above everyone's heads. The giant hand was like a mountain covering the sky and the sun. Chapter 696. The true body of Anubis finally made its move after figuring out all the secrets of Imogen. One of its right hands tore apart the sky of the underworld, and its palm looked as vast as the sky. Zhang Ziqiang saw this scene through Menes. He secretly gulped and said in a trembling voice, Is this the Buddha's palm? Chunong had once reminded them that the Amzi oasis was a world between the real world and the imaginary space. It had part of the laws of the real world, but it obviously also had part of the nature of the imaginary space. Just like the concept of imaginary numbers, the imaginary space was the coordinates of the real space. There was no size, space, distance, or even direction. Such a discrete and non-continuous space-time was the imaginary space. As everyone knew, the symbol for imaginary numbers was equal to the square root of -1, or I squared, equals -1. Its mathematical meaning was actually on the one-dimensional real number axis, using mathematics to represent the change of 1 and -1 in the two-dimensional plane coordinate system. In the real number axis, the coordinate of 1 was rotated 180 degrees counterclockwise with the origin as the center, and it would coincide with -1 in the coordinate axis. Using mathematics to redefine this process by rotating the coordinate by 90 degrees counterclockwise and defining it as I, then one could get the definition formula for imaginary numbers, I squared, equals -1. That is, a real number 1 rotated counterclockwise by 90 degrees in the plane coordinate axis equals -1. The meaning of imaginary numbers was to represent the coordinate axis of real numbers, which were numbers that did not exist in the one-dimensional universe. In the one-dimensional universe, the universe was a straight line that extended endlessly and all positions could be represented by real numbers. The coordinate relationships of the two-dimensional universe, such as direction and angle, did not exist in the one-dimensional universe and could be called imaginary numbers. Using this non-existent relationship to redefine the relationship between real numbers in the one-dimensional axis, this was called the imaginary number operation. Then, relative to the coordinate 1, the solution obtained by the imaginary number operation 1 asterisk I was the point represented by 0, 1 in the two-dimensional plane coordinate system, and the space represented by the imaginary number I was the plane coordinate axis y relative to the real number axis x. Then, one could obtain another one-dimensional universe y relative to the coordinate axis of the one-dimensional universe x. Y could be called the imaginary space of x. In the one-dimensional world, imaginary numbers were real numbers with an additional directional variable. The imaginary number 1 asterisk I of a one-dimensional coordinate axis was represented by a real number, 0, 1, in a two-dimensional coordinate axis. However, in the one-dimensional universe, the directional variable did not exist, so it was called an imaginary number. When the one-dimensional universe was upgraded, this imaginary number would have practical significance. Then let me ask you, does 1 asterisk I make sense on the real one-dimensional axis? Chen turned around and asked the reincarnators, who were already shocked by the boundless, planet-sized giant hand. Edward borrowed the mysterious image of Chen in their hearts to temporarily shake off the impact of this shocking scene. He replied in a low voice, "It's meaningless because it doesn't exist, but in higher latitudes, it has meaning. Therefore, it exists and doesn't exist. Relative to the one-dimensional universe, it doesn't exist, but in higher latitudes, it does exist." It's the same for the underworld. The underworld is not an imaginary space, but it is a world that exists and doesn't exist after the three-dimensional space has undergone imaginary changes. Using length, width, height, and space to define it is meaningless because it doesn't exist in the three-dimensional space. Chen lamented, "Why do I say that the Assam oasis and the underworld are God's kingdoms on earth? Because it has some characteristics of information interference. This is a world that deviates from the information in the real space. In the real world, because of the ebb of the origin tide, the gods are greatly restricted and bound. If Anubis appears in the real world, I have 18,000 ways to toy with him to death. However, in this space where imaginary numbers are calculated, there is a high dimensional deviation from the real world. There are some characteristics that the real world does not possess. It's also a place where the gods can use a part of their power. Here, there exists the law of God's words as law." Looking at the dumbfounded reincarnators, Chen smiled and explained, "It's a characteristic of high-dimensional information that directly interferes with matter. It's also a law that must exist in a world like the underworld. The essence of the soul is a projection of high-dimensional information. So in this world where the soul reincarnates and judges, it will definitely allow high-dimensional information to interfere with matter to a greater extent. So in the real world, it's difficult for the soul to even interfere with light and shadow. When it's difficult to pick up a stone, it's invisible and untouchable. But in the worlds like the underworld, hell, and heaven, it can appear and exist. Compared to the soul, the essence of the gods is extremely similar, but more powerful. They are all projections of high-dimensional information. Here, the information interference from the higher dimensions can display greater power, which means that the interference ability of divine power has become stronger. Looking at the hand of judgment slowly falling from the sky, Chen said lightly, "That is why Anubis can magnify the material power of high-dimensional information distortion to such an extent. In the real world, the high-dimensional information that a stone can carry can only slightly change its nature. It can set off a sandstorm in the desert. It can make the land desertified. However, even if Anubis uses all his strength to turn a fist-sized stone into gold, his divine power will be exhausted. But in this world, divine power can change the color of heaven and earth with a single thought. A single word can turn a mountain into gold. An ordinary rock that contains divine power can evolve into a planet. A palm that contains divine power can cover the sky. Edward's expression changed abruptly. Then why are we still dealing with Anubis in the underworld? In the real world, does he dare to show himself? Chenong laughed. Don't underestimate a god's endurance. In the real world, even if I stepped on the face of his statue, he would still be able to endure it. In the world of the underworld, a gigantic golden hand came crashing down. The magma on the ground of the underworld was pulled by a tremendous gravitational force, shooting up towards Anubis's hand. The tremendous change in gravitational force tore apart the continent beneath Imogen's feet. As the gigantic hand descended inch by inch, the lines on Anubis's hand gradually became clearer. Like a mountain abyss, an incomparably powerful force instantly tore apart space, and the entire world of the underworld seemed as if it was about to be destroyed. Menes controlled her gaze and stared at Anubis's hand that came crashing down with unparalleled power. The full-powered spatial collapse formed a distorted black hole that was dozens of kilometers wide beneath the gigantic hand. The spatial collapse caused an even more powerful collapse force, and the tremendous gravitational force between the gigantic hand and the black hole instantly tore the world of the underworld into a world of lava with thousands of ravines. Countless wailing black shadows of souls turned into ashes. The mountains on the vast land of the underworld collapsed, and the mountains were torn apart as they rose into the sky. The entire world was collapsing and surged towards the gravitational turbulence. It was as if the entire world was about to be devoured by these two existences that were gradually approaching each other. Anubis's hand clenched slightly, and the powerful gravitational force almost tore the black hole created by Menes into pieces. Menes's face turned red, and her body swayed. Her life force was being sucked away at a visible rate. Will couldn't care less about restraining Anubis anymore. He rushed to Menes's side like a ball of distorted, glazed light. He grabbed her and said, "We need your future power. Look at me and search for your shadow in the lower reaches of the river of time and space. Remember, that is your own power." Chapter 697. The power of the endless eye triggered a change in the illusory space, completely collapsing the underworld. The vast world that Anubis had opened up quickly collapsed towards the singularity where Menes's gaze converged. Like pulling out a tablecloth from a hole in a table, countless matter was torn apart by gravity and collapsed towards the singularity. The earth was torn into huge chunks and then collapsed into even finer fragments the size of mountains, which were sucked into the black hole and disappeared. A tornado of matter formed outside the huge black hole, blocking the giant hand in front of Menes. Anubis's body came from the vast and invisible sky. Useless struggle. His giant hand grasped the air slightly, and his divine words resounded like thunder. In these 3 moments, there are 18,300 outcomes, all under the coverage of my divine power. As I observe, there are another 39,000 outcomes after this divine word. Among them, there are 25,000 outcomes for you to die without a burial place, and 8,000 outcomes for you to linger on with your last breaths. Imogen, don't you know what the biggest difference between me and you false gods is? God, the omniscient and omnipotent. The giant hand in the sky continued to press down, and Anubis's palm seemed to have turned into a black hole, causing the void to collapse. Even a huge black hole formed by Menes's full-powered spatial collapse was nothing more than a futile resistance in front of this power. Will activated his ability with all his might. He tried to trace the past and future of the giant hand, but no matter how he tried, the giant hand in the sky seemed to press down on them eternally. Will changed his method. He began to activate his ability, seeking the strongest future state of Menes. He saw that under the special perspective of the river of time, Menes' future was like a winding giant snake entrenched in the timeline, and all kinds of future projections of Menes that emitted great power appeared behind the present Menes. Will stretched out his hand towards the future projection of the most powerful meanies that he could perceive, but before he could touch her, the projection burst like a bubble. This was followed by a second and a third. In Way's vision, the shadows that represented Meanie's future were disappearing on a large scale. The massive amount of information about the future was rapidly shrinking, and the endless possibilities were collapsing. Countless possible futures for Meanies had already been wiped out. The timeline that he could reach was getting closer and closer. Hundreds of years later, decades later, the time distortion projection that was like a long river shrunk into a small segment. The rest of the future was covered by Anubis. In those future possibilities, Anubis killed Meanies and covered the timeline of her survival. Will finally saw the tip of Anubis's iceberg. What he revealed wasn't just the gigantic hand in the sky, but also the infinite timelines that covered almost all the possibilities that Will could pry into at this moment. Omniscience was omnipotence. A god's great power didn't lie in their destructive power and energy. Instead, it lay in the information that they encompassed and covered their information. Whoever had more possibilities and covered more timelines was the more powerful god. When Anubis had fought with the four abominations, Anubis had already covered enough information. He had already grasped all the variables of the abilities of the four abominations and controlled all of their possibilities. Therefore, when Him took action to restrain the timelines, every possibility of Meanies was under Anubis's control. Any of their resistance, any of the variables of the relevant information, could not escape Anubis' control. Him was like a huge shadow that encompassed the four abominations. Toward them, Anubis was already omniscient and omnipotent. Now, the only variables that could exceed Anubis's variables were Imidin, who hadn't made a move yet, and Chanam, who was hiding behind Meanie's eyes. Only they were not in the range of Anubis's omniscience and omnipotence. Only then could they expand a timeline variable that was not under Anubis' control in a short period of time. Only then would there be enough possibilities for them to turn the tables. The time that Anubis had reserved for the abominations was 3 seconds. In these short 3 seconds, if no new variables exceeded Anubis' control, then after 3 seconds, Meanies and the other 3 would be slapped to death by Anubis. The 4 abominations had already been included in Anubis's omniscience. Any resistance they made was within Anubis's expectations. However, Anubis still did not let his guard down. This was because there were still 2 important factors that he had yet to bring into his control. The first was Imidin. Anubis had not been able to cover Imidin's information with the information, so a huge variable could happen at any time. The second was Meanie's eyes. He already knew that Chun Ong and the others were hiding in the world behind Meanie's eyes. However, this variable outside of the information was like a fog that could not be dispelled. In the first second, the gigantic black hole that caused the illusory space to collapse was destroyed by the gigantic hand. The next second, Meanies looked at Anubis's hand in despair, which had already reached their heads. The time distortion was mercilessly torn apart by Anubis, but Imidin remained silent, as if he was ignoring the fatal blow that was about to land on his head at any moment. His variables had not interfered with all of this. Sekimu burned his original sin and launched a desperate revenge against Anubis. The revenge that he had been accumulating for 2,500 years was charging towards Anubis with Sekai's despair. Sekimu's endless hatred towards the gods was triggered because he had truly felt it before, but had never received any motherly love. Sekimu's original sin was twisted as he launched a desperate revenge. Sekimu only wanted to use the sin caused by the god's desires to create a sin loophole that connected to the God Soul database. The resentment of countless souls in hell towards the gods in the river of time converged into a gigantic sin mutation that was locked onto Anubis by Sekimu. The gigantic sin mutation that came from countless souls gathered the despairing thoughts of countless souls. At that instant, the information of the sin mutation's variable greatly expanded. Even the tiniest of souls had miracles that the gods were unable to control. When these tiny miracles gathered together, they would create a qualitative change that even the gods would fear. This change would be beyond the gods' control. However, this sin had the possibility of surpassing Anubis's omniscience. However, Sekimu, who guided the sin mutation, didn't. Sekimu's every move was covered by Anubis's information. The powerful original sin mutation didn't even have the chance to harm Anubis before Anubis eliminated it. This was just like the oldest and most basic type of internet virus, which attacked the target computer by creating a tremendous amount of spam. The countless souls in hell were filled with resentment towards the gods, and the resulting sin was indeed enough to taint the gods' divinity. However, Sekai Densely, who guided this power, was able to easily block the request to pass through Anubis and loophole. Chapter 698. In the virtual space, Chenong raised his head. There was no aura of great power about him. Ever since he entered the Master God space, Chenong had existed as a mortal. Not only did he not display the power he had in the world of Shushan, he had opened up the world of orthodoxy beyond the seas. He had opened the calamity of the four seas, and he controlled the seven great innate waters. He also did not control the most basic superpower cells in his body to restore the hyperdimensional power of the apocalypse. He had always maintained a power that was below the Master God's vigilance. He had either used knowledge to develop the Master God's power system, or he had used the ancient Egyptian spell system in the plot world, using the two scriptures to pry open the power of spells. That was why, even though the reincarnators had been trained to the point of submission, they did not see power beyond 10 stars or even 11 stars from him. In terms of power, Chun-Ong was still immortal and might not be as powerful as Imodin. Chun-Ang's gaze followed the various connections, piercing through the layers of virtual space to meet the owner of the giant hand in the sky of the underworld, Anubis, through Mini's eyes. It was as if he was looking at an excellent experimental material. "I've finally locked onto you. That wasn't easy." Chenong sighed. "Ever since I entered this world, I've confirmed that the time and industrial foundation this world has left me does not allow me to slowly develop technology and finally materialize the will of China. The Master God surveillance of the plot world is both strict and negligent. The strictness lies in the fact that any power beyond the threshold of 10 stars will be closely monitored. As a result, I can't expose my power and resources. The negligence lies in the fact that there are many loopholes in the surveillance of powers below the threshold of 10 stars. For the Republic to be reborn in this world, it must have the will of China descend. This is not a difficult task, but in the plot world closely monitored by the Master God, I must find a residence for it, an existence that can act as the residence for the will of China, which is essentially the soul of a civilization. At the very least, it must be someone with authority or a god-level existence. Without such an existence as a carrier, the Republic will not be able to take root under the Master God surveillance. So, I've been waiting for you for a long time. Anubis. It is only by disguising will of China as a god that the prime gods would not be able to detect the anomaly in this world, while at the same time turning the Republic, a treasure of proof that the apocalypse had prepared for itself, into a tumor that lurks within the prime god system. The apocalypse wants to place the Republic into a system that is naturally suited for the development of civilization, while the true god wants to use the prime god system that is naturally able to sense the coordinates of the multiverse to nurture more possibilities for himself. River Styx went to the primordial world to prove his Tao. Adam wanted to imitate the god space and open up his own experimental Tao field. That's why I'm here to guide Imodin to stare into the abyss, forcing him to kill a god. That's to separate the existence of Anubis, borrowing the idea of Anubis to let will of China go public through a backdoor. I've already prepared the backdoor. Yinglong has already rushed to the First Emperor's mausoleum and replaced will of China with Qin First Emperor. Using the understanding and knowledge of countless individuals in will of China about Qin First Emperor as a foundation, he will reshape the virtual personality Qin First Emperor. When Anubis's divinity is split into two, the two undead empires of the East and the West will be born in the burning of the divine fire. Imodin will lose himself and ascend to the throne as a god, while Qin First Emperor will be reborn from the long river of history, leading the undead army in the First Emperor's mausoleum to recreate the Chinese Empire. When the confrontation between the two undead empires reaches its peak, triggering the third plot of the Mummy, the legend of Qianqin, I will return to this world again. At that time, Chinese Empire will destroy the Mummy dynasty, and the Chinese people in this world will be able to inherit Will of China, transforming the Chinese Empire into the Republic of China. Chenong suddenly recalled the conversation between them after the birth of Yinglong. As long as I get the essence of Anubis, I can transform it into an external component of Will of China. Chenong looked at Yinglong and said, with the help of the essence of Anubis, we can create our own gods. I think Qin First Emperor is a good choice, and it can reasonably start the third plot. At that time, your personalities preserved in Will of China by the Republic of China can directly cover the consciousness of the current Chinese people, essentially resurrecting the Republic of China. In the later technology tree, under the condition of controlling a god, you should be able to achieve the conditions to liberate this world before the time cycle of this world is completed. However, Yinglong shook his head and said, China in this world has just been liberated from the rule of the Manchurian Qing dynasty and has woken up from the darkness of ignorance. Its people are ignorant and self-abased, and its culture is backward and feudal. It is not enough to carry the glory and ideals of the Republic. However, if we cover her with our personalities and consciousness, how is that different from killing the Chinese people of this era? The Republic of China is a pursuit, a legacy, and an ideal, not a group of wandering ghosts trying to take over another person's body. We are the corpses of the past that have taken over the people of the present. Even if we stand up again, we will only be a group of walking corpses. Only they will be strong in fear, aware in pain, awaken in ignorance, accept and find the light that we pass on to them. That is the civilization that will truly inherit our will. For this, so what if we, the wandering ghosts, all dissipate in the long river of history? We are not an old and stale country, but a civilization that is constantly advancing and expanding. They are our past, and they have our heritage. When they understand our ideals and agree with our beliefs, the will of China will naturally continue. Then you will all be buried, Chenong said in a deep voice. At the beginning of the ancient times, who taught? The top and bottom have not yet formed. So how can we test them? The road is long, and I will search from top to bottom. My heart is good, and even if I die 9 times, I will not regret it. Yinglong looked at the sky above his head and sighed deeply. We may disappear, but the Republic will never grow old. Then let's start the Qianqin plan. Let the China of this world learn pride and confidence, understand seeking and perseverance, and carry on the glory of the Chinese civilization. When humans replace immortals, when science surpasses myths, and immortals willingly become mortals, the Great Wall of Qianqin will collapse, and the new republic will be reborn. Spear come. As soon as he finished speaking, a spear that seemed to be the convergence of endless light appeared in Chenong's hand. It was solemn and sacred, like a holy object that was worshipped on an altar in ancient Egypt. However, under the spear, near where Chenong's right hand was a simple Chinese character engraved on it, and the light on the tip of the spear illuminated the endless darkness of the illusory space. The name engraved on it suppressed this powerful artifact that had been modified by Chun-Ong. Chun-Ong raised the spear of judgment in his hand. The body of the spear was engraved with the name Chun-Ong, and it carried a tiny but intrinsically powerful, dazzling divinity that surpassed Anubis by countless folds. Its use was to conceal the detection of the will of China hidden within the spear of judgment. Beyond the immeasurable distance of the multiverse, at the core of the massive nested gray space, a being that looked identical to Chun-Ong stood amidst the endless divine light at the core of the gray space. He slowly pushed the wheel of the gray space, turning fate and time, all things and all life. When Chun-Ong threw the spear of judgment in his hand, the being suddenly opened his eyes. "What's wrong, Lord Chun?" His Holiness Ong Chun. Another god who was following him respectfully asked curiously. The being shook his head slightly and smiled. It's nothing. I'm borrowing my true name. As Menes and the others looked on in despair, a ray of light suddenly shot out from the collapsed black hole formed by the Eye of Infinity that connected the illusory space. Like a meteor, it streaked across the sky of this world that was about to be destroyed. Imogen saw that the core of that ray of light was a very familiar spear. The Spear of Judgment. Anubis also recognized that it was a divine artifact that he had forged himself, but he did not understand. Who could harm him with a weapon that he had made? Not to mention that the Spear of Judgment could not even pierce his true location. The being that operated the wheel of crystal wall suddenly said, "Anything that has my true name on it cannot be reversed. It will definitely be hit by karma." The Spear of Judgment pierced through the dark underworld like a brilliant meteor and disappeared into the sky that Anubis had covered. Anubis let out an angry roar. At the core of his divine fire, a Spear of Judgment silently appeared in the middle. His divine fire and being were split into two halves by this spear that carried a trace of ultimate divinity. Half of it was possessed by a vast will, which tore through the void and disappeared. Mummy E2, main mission completed. All Samsara travelers return. The Samsara travelers in the illusory space, as well as Shun Tu Gong and the others under Imogen, were stunned. They disappeared from the illusory space and the underworld with confused looks on their faces. The abyss in Imogen's eyes devoured the underworld. With deep darkness and destruction, it also devoured the other half. Anubis's god kingdom was torn into a dark abyss. Imogen's consciousness wandered in the abyss. The enormous soul and divine power that Anubis had accumulated was completely devoured by Imogen. In the abyss, he scattered his soul and used his divine power to cultivate. After a while, death guards and undead spirits emerged from the abyss one after another. They passed through the corrupted underworld and turned to the Isim Oasis, appearing in the yellow sands north of the Sahara in Sudan. The Isim Oasis could no longer be called an oasis. It was burning with lava and hellfire. Right in the middle was a pyramid made of obsidian. Countless spirits climbed up the pyramid. In the mausoleum of the Qin first emperor, the bronze man on the bronze carriage suddenly opened his eyes. He looked around. The densely packed terracotta warriors were trembling slightly. However, these terracotta warriors were made of steel, machinery as their structure, and fission energy as their core. Inglong stared at a huge steel mill in the center of the mausoleum of the first emperor. Boiling molten steel flowed along the tracks into an indescribable space. After being reshaped by the will of the Qin first emperor, it became part of a huge base. Chapter 699. The underground palace of the Qin mausoleum had been developed into a vast underground world. What Chun'ang's spear had torn apart was not only Anubis divinity, but also the kingdom of Asim that he had created. Half of the illusory space had been moved here, turning this place into a half-real, half-illusory arcane realm. The vast underground palace of the Qin mausoleum had become Emperor Qin's half-divine kingdom. Countless terracotta soldiers and puppets were working here. Hurry up and fix the main mausoleum. Those foreigners are idiots. They have no knowledge of China's etiquette system and the culture of the Qin mausoleum. They put the Qin first emperor's coffin on a carriage, and the structure of the first emperor's mausoleum has become strange. They even want us to clean up their mess. Inglong commanded the industrial robots to place the bronze coffin in the main hall of the floating divine palace. For this, not only did they use special superconducting magnetic materials, they also created an anti-gravity illusory space in the main burial chamber of the founding emperor mausoleum. With the vast floating divine palace as the center, the terracotta army was densely packed underground, which was being modified by magic and technology. Then, at the edge of the main burial chamber, there was an underground palace built to look like a city of the Qin dynasty. It included weapons manufacturing, puppet, robot, manufacturing, scientific research, and the development of magic and divinity of a large area. The entire illusory space of the founding emperor mausoleum, which was transformed from the Akim oasis, was as majestic as an underground heavenly palace. A young man next to Yinglong looked up at the floating palace built in China's traditional style. He emphasized, "The details must be real." This concerns the most important part of our Xianqin project, the acceptance level of this era by the Chinese. Why we have to go through so much trouble and make up a non-existent Xianqin era? Because if we drive spaceships and use planetary obliteration cannons and dimensional distortion bombs, will our compatriots in this era accept us? They will only feel that we are a civilization that is even more foreign than the Westerners. They will not be able to integrate with us and resonate with us. Therefore, although the apocalypse is our greatest enemy, Adam is right about one thing. We must take the initiative to integrate into the Chinese civilization of this era, even if it's a big lie. Yinglong frowned. The man nodded and said, "Yes, even if we have to lie to the heavens. We also need to let the Chinese of this era understand us and take the initiative to integrate with us. Only then can we subtly change them. If there were even 1,000,000 cyborgs carrying our personalities, we could forcibly assimilate them in the form of the government. But even if the information interference window, will of China, Qin First Emperor, has the ability to interfere with reality on a large scale, we can only carry the personalities of over 200 compatriots, and we are already the last batch in the plan. Therefore, we must focus on the people of this era and reshape civilization. The compatriots of this era do not understand advanced technology, science, and science. We can completely repackage it and change it to a way that they can accept and that the people will like to hear and see. For example, we can call science the Great Way, call learning cultivation, call the young people of the new era who have science, ideals, morals, knowledge, and discipline, call them immortals, call genetic surgery body tempering, call nanomedical robots elixirs, and call technological weapons magic weapons. Won't the people like to hear and see these things? In my opinion, not only will they accept it, but they will also actively pursue it. China's 1,000-year dream of becoming immortals is no joke. For the reshaping of the Republic, this is the simplest path. Moreover, the compatriots of this world will soon face the attack of the Western undead army. When Imogen massacres cities and countries in Europe, how are we going to explain the interference theory under the grand unification theory to them? The scientific thinking of this world is destined to be even more difficult to develop. Why don't we first build a civilization that is half scientific and half mysterious? When the conditions are met, we can leap out from this civilization and let the Republic be reborn, going public through a back door. Yinglong, you have to understand. Moreover, from the Qin First Emperor. Ahem. Forget it. I still don't admit that the Western three-headed black dragon is the Qin First Emperor. The 5 elements and mortal arts obtained from his original consciousness have been recompiled by the will of China. Much of the content on information energy mechanics and information interference has been deciphered. There are also some things that our science can't study systematically for the time being, but they have been perfected according to the traditional magic system. At present, we already have the possibility of promoting learning on a large scale. The future Xianqin will not only be a cultivation civilization disguised with technology, but it will also slowly sprout and develop into a real cultivation civilization. When we degenerate and emerge, those who are unwilling to follow us can also continue down this path and become a branch of the Chinese civilization. As long as they don't violate basic humanity and the will of China, they will be our branch civilization, the Xianqin civilization. After hearing this, Yinglong smiled bitterly and said, "Although what you said makes sense, it still conflicts with my worldview. The foundation of the Republic's civilization lies in science, and the spirit of science lies in advancing, understanding, research, and development. Those things that we can't understand at the moment will eventually become a part of it. That's why I instinctively reject trickery and deceit. I believe that science will always move towards truth, and all lies will go against it. That's why I'm here to mediate. Although the Xianqin plan has its flaws, it's in line with the Republic's changes and development. My codename is Li Si, and I'll push forward the Xianqin plan. Long, since the plan has been decided, you should try your best to avoid being affected by this emotion when you're carrying out your mission. That Professor Chan Ong must have been influenced by the apocalypse when he pushed forward this plan. It seems like he wants another control group to enrich the existence of the Chinese civilization. Li Si and Long both looked down at the huge construction site that was the mausoleum of the first emperor. In this heavenly palace and underground palace that were rich in detail but were essentially absurd, all sorts of anti-gravity devices, gravitational weapons, energy weapons, individual weapons, and other high-tech facilities had reappeared in a different way. Most of the facilities, including lighting, communication, and energy, had been changed to a simple and unadorned appearance that had the aesthetic characteristics of the Warring States period and celestial culture. There were also wireless networks and circuits, with special energy constructs that could receive wireless emission of electric current and perform functions such as lighting, heating, and cooling. There were also several different designs, including lights that hovered like pearls and even the real celestial stars above their heads. These ingenious lamps were essentially very advanced energy technology, but under the packaging of immortal culture. Who could deny that these were the handiwork of immortals? If a qualified citizen of the Republic was defined as a celestial being, their ability would not necessarily be inferior to the celestial beings of legends. In fact, they might even be much more powerful. After all, there were no internet novels of the future, and the level of celestial beings was at most that of a planet, a trifle for a high-dimensional civilization, such as the Republic. Liquid metals that resembled mercury permeated every branch of the mausoleum of the first emperor. They were composed of substantial nanomachines, the fruits of the Republic's research on intelligent matter based on the foundation of Skynet. Since it could self-replicate, its supply capacity increased exponentially when the virtual divinity Qin First Emperor used its divine power to create a portion of it. Now, by recreating the scene of the first emperor's mausoleum with Mercury as the 4 blasphemies, the 100 rivers, the 5 mountains, and the 9 provinces, it provided irrefutable proof of the creation of a Xianqin civilization and the continuation of the source of China's civilization. Li Si said emotionally, "I'll flip through Candle-Blowing Ghost later and use it as a teaching material to create the basic structure and details of the first emperor's mausoleum. Together with the virtual floating celestial palace in Meth, we must make the mausoleum of the first emperor shock the people of China. Only then will we be able to lay a good foundation for the birth of the Xianqin civilization." Meanwhile, Long, who was supervising the modification of the terracotta soldiers, war robots, was speechless. The person in charge, codenamed Meng Tian, explained to him, "Currently, we're focusing on the modification of the Qin crossbow. Originally, we planned to design a small missile in the shape of a Qin crossbow. With our technology, a missile the size of a bow and arrow can already cross continents. Its lethality is as high as 9,000 tons of TNT, but Li Si objected. Long was speechless. Now, our main enemy is the Chinese warlords who don't even have heavy firepower and can't gather enough bullets. Is there a need to design such an exaggerated weapon? Therefore, we changed the plan later and designed the Qin crossbow as a cold weapon that uses telepathy. Its magnetic fluid propulsion speed is fast, and its lethality is relatively low, but it is flexible and small. It also meets the design requirements of the celestial culture. Just like a flying sword, through the detection and sensing device built into the terracotta soldiers, its lethality is the same as an arrow, but it is very flexible. Not only can it be used in long-range combat, but it can also be used in close combat like a flying sword. We originally designed it based on the functions of a flying sword. Although its lethality is a little low, it is more in line with the requirements of less casualties and more captives in a civil war." Long nodded. "What we lack now is not a lethality weapon, but a lethality controllability. This modification is reasonable." "How's the modification progress of the terracotta soldiers?" Meng Tian explained. "Initially, we chose the direction of a low-cost robot with a simple structure, ready to be used in a large army battle. But we soon discovered that our biggest demand is actually raw materials. The raw materials purchased through the external Horus's eye forces are far from meeting our needs. However, China's industrial foundation is too poor. No, it should be said that there is no industrial foundation at all. Xianyang's local mines have already been developed to the limit, and there is a huge shortage of raw materials. Therefore, we changed it to the path of elite soldiers. Currently, we are using the basic design of low-level mechanical descent bodies. After the relevant modifications, the template of the terracotta soldiers is a Chinese man who is 1.8 to 2 meters tall. They are equipped with a magnetic phase personal shield. The halberd in their hands is a circular vibration energy halberd. Not only can it shoot high-energy rays, but the halberd also has a high-frequency vibration. They have the ability to fly, a small gravitational anti-gravity engine, and a maximum flying speed of Mach 2. The left palm is an infrasonic energy disabling weapon, and the right palm can eject a variety of bombs called thunder magic. The original fragments of consciousness in the terracotta soldiers have been extracted and transformed into AI. Chapter 700. The Pole of the World, Shangri-La. The Qinghai, Tibet Plateau was extremely cold all year round, shrouding this world. But in the wind and snow, there was a hidden fairyland-like secret land, Shangri-La. The fairies Yuan lived here in seclusion. 2,200 years ago, it was she who sealed the Qin first emperor. Of course, the sleeping dragon emperor in the Qin mausoleum was no longer the three-headed black dragon. Her virtual personality, which was remolded by will of China, was useless in front of the Qin first emperor, who gathered the knowledge and belief of the first emperor of the Republic of China. Now that he had obtained half of the divinity of Anubis and the divinity of the first emperor, he no longer needed the fountain of youth in Shangri-La to obtain immortality. As a manifestation of the soul of a high-dimensional civilization, even a virtual personality, Will of China had a higher status than Anubis. Imodin had obtained half of the divinity of Anubis, and Will of China had obtained half of the divinity of Anubis. There was a huge difference in the utilization and results. Ziyuan stood in front of the Fountain of Youth. Her daughter, Shaolin, hurried over from outside the secret land of Shangri-La. Without waiting for her to approach, Ziyuan took out a dagger decorated with ancient patterns from behind her and said to Shaolin, "A month ago, there was a wildfire in the west. I felt the death of a strong will in the far west. At that time, I felt that the tyrant's seal had disappeared. Over the past month, a murderous aura has occupied the west. I have a feeling that there will be a disaster in the world. After my constant confirmation, the tyrant should have taken this opportunity to get rid of the seal and reappear in the world. The world will suffer, and a bloody storm is coming. The tyrant longs to be immortal, so I must stay here to guard the Fountain of Youth and stop his ambition to rule the world forever. With the tyrant's cruelty, if he is allowed to live forever, it will bring a great disaster to the world." Shaolin took the dagger and said, "I will stop him, mother. I refined this dagger with magic. It is the only weapon that can kill the tyrant. Take advantage of the fact that the tyrant has just broken the seal and is at his weakest, and you have to stab it into his heart." Ziyuan instructed, "Remember, your father died under the torture of a tyrant. If his army returns to this world, it will bring a great disaster to the common people. You must kill him. Right now, the Dragon Emperor doesn't have enough power to summon his army. But if he obtains the power of the immortal spring, or if the moon in the sky waxes and wanes 9 times, he will be able to recover enough to summon the Terracotta army." The Dragon Emperor had mastered the power of the 5 elements from the hands of the warlocks. Although he was strong, he was not invincible. But his army, in the current China, is invincible. Shaolin was puzzled. Now that the warlords of China have mastered the power of gunpowder, they have an army that can use firearms. Today's war is more terrible than any era. With such a powerful army, why would they be afraid of an emperor and his army from 2,000 years ago? Maybe we can use the army of the warlords to help us take revenge. However, Ziyuan sneered and said, "I have to say that although the Dragon Emperor is a tyrant, he is a man with great ambitions. Although the current warlords of China have firearms that surpass those of his era, their talent and boldness are far inferior to the Dragon Emperor. He is a brutal, cunning, tenacious, and ambitious tyrant. His army obeys orders strictly and rejoices at the news of battle. It is not comparable to the warlords of today. The warlords know how to use firearms, but doesn't the Dragon Emperor know how to use them? His Qin crossbow army is the best at drawing on the strengths of the enemy. Moreover, it is an undead army. When he learns how to use firearms from the warlords, his undead army will be 10 times more terrifying than the Qin dynasty. At that time, it will no longer be China alone. His ambition will be the whole world. Furthermore, the Dragon Emperor's book is written in the same language, and the carriage is on the same track. His prestige in China is very strong. And in this dark era, there will definitely be many ambitious people who want to rely on him. Right now, the common people are very eager for a strong ruler to lead them out of this difficult and dark era. If the Dragon Emperor ascends the throne again, the consequences will be unimaginable. Shaolin frowned and said in horror, "Mother, are you saying that someone will help the Dragon Emperor? Not just 1 or 2 people?" Ziyuan said, "The lifespan of mortals is only a mere 100 years. They have long forgotten the terror of the Dragon Emperor. Now that China is suffering from invasion and oppression, everyone from the top to the bottom yearns for this tyrant to restore the glory of the past. They yearn to follow him to conquer the world. Mortals are not like us, immortal. After experiencing the chaos of the 5 barbarians and the Yuan dynasty entering the Central Plains, they have already seen through the struggles of the world. Time passes like flowing water. The glory and disgrace of the world, the rise and fall of the world, they have all seen through it. I'm afraid they don't understand the terror of the Dragon Emperor and are vainly trying to control him to achieve their own desires. They don't know that they are accomplices to a villain." Ziyuan shouted, "We must stop these ambitious people. Originally, I thought that the only thing in the world that can unseal the Dragon Emperor is the Eye of Shangri-La. So I was going to give it to Yingyi and use Yingyi to help us protect this thing that can help the Dragon Emperor break the seal. But because of the accident a month ago, the Dragon Emperor still broke the seal. The Eye of Shangri-La has a magical power. We can't let it fall into the hands of the Dragon Emperor again. Now, the Eye of Shangri-La is in Shanghai. You go and get it back this time." "Yes, mother," Shaolin said, holding his sword. In the short period of peace after World War I, the Qinghai, Tibet Plateau, was more like a land of peace and tranquility. When China was divided by warlords and wars were endless, this plateau was like a pure land without war. It still maintained the ancient order of serfs and nobles. The primitive and cruel feudal order firmly existed here. The lamas were the spiritual masters of this land, while the Tibetan nobles were the political masters of this land. The special geographical environment led to the central government of the Northern Ocean to rule this land only nominally. The Tibetan serf owners took advantage of the special environment of neighboring India and colluded with the British. 6 years ago, they concocted the McMahon Line. On the snow-capped mountains and grasslands, a long line of people appeared. But if one looked closely, one would find that these people with a human appearance were actually a group of special troops with steel as the structure, electrons as the nerves, small cold fusion cores as the energy source, and special ceramic plates inlaid on the skin. The hardness of these ceramic plates was amazing. They were generally used to defend against anti-material sniper rifles, and the effect was even more amazing in defending against weapons and cold weapons. There was also a group of Qin crossbow troops among them. The crossbows in their hands had the shape of a crossbow, but they were high-tech. They had their own radar scanning function, electronic command components, and guidance capabilities. The crossbow box installed on the crossbow also had the auxiliary function of a launching platform. The large launching platform was integrated into a small crossbow, disguised as a magic weapon. The ingenuity of this could not be said to be not ingenious. Seeing the red walls and golden roof of a temple vaguely appearing in the distant snow-capped mountains, a group of terracotta soldiers stationed on a relatively flat platform. Wang Jian, who was ordered to control Tibet, took out an infrared positioning telescope and easily locked the location of the Lama temple. He smiled and said, "Although the Qin crossbow troops with ballistic missiles have been rejected, the equipment produced before cannot be wasted. However, the equipment produced before cannot be wasted. Although it is difficult to develop resources in Tibet, with our scientific and technological strength, we can still achieve results." Before the implementation of the Xianqin plan in the mausoleum of the first emperor begins, we must develop and expand a new base here. At the same time, we must start the exploration of the resource points of Shangri-La. Since the central government has decided to start the Xianqin plan, then we must first solve these obstacles that compete with us for the right to speak in religion and theology. In the future, when Xianqin enters Tibet, we must not let a group of lamas come and talk nonsense with us. Li Exun, who was next to him, was busy adjusting the trajectory. Seeing that the Qin crossbow in his hand had already locked on it several coordinates that had been detected, he turned his head and ordered, "Prepare to fire! 3, 2, 1. Just as Yuan and her daughter, Shaolin, were explaining the important task of sealing the Dragon Emperor, 28 Qin crossbows shot into the air 5,000 meters to the left of the temple in the north of the Tranquil Mountains. The tail feathers of the 28 crossbow bolts spewed out light blue ferrofluid propellers, cutting into the stratosphere at a gentle speed. Another crossbow bolt directly shot into the top of the Lama temple not far away. The powerful force allowed it to shoot through the golden roof. Under the horrified gazes of the Lama in the main temple, it sank deep under their feet. Soon after, accompanied by huge flames and shock waves, the other 27 crossbow bolts shot in all directions. In the Patala Palace in Lhasa, a monk looked at a small black dot in the sky that was rapidly approaching. The black dot's flight trajectory was completely different from that of a falcon. At the moment he hesitated, he saw the black dot deeply penetrate into the main hall of the Patala Palace behind him. Then, a blazing white fireball erupted not far away from him. At the foot of the mountain, the serfs who were not qualified to enter the palace worshipped the Patala Palace devoutly. Chapter 701. Houghton's lips trembled slightly as he stared at the information his team members had painstakingly collected. They had only been here for half a day, but they had already realized how ridiculous this mission was. Their first main mission was to help Imodin conquer London, and their second main mission was to release the sealed Dragon Emperor and fight against Imodin's undead crusade army. The former reincarnators had created a huge problem for them. For the mission reward, they had actually helped Imodin kill Anubis and allowed Imodin to obtain Anubis's divinity, which was many times more dangerous than the original plot. Now, for some unknown reason, the Lord God probably wanted to intervene in the muddy waters of the previous reincarnators so that the former reincarnators' plan would be destroyed to a certain extent. It seemed like the Lord God didn't want them to succeed. Houghton pondered seriously for a moment and noticed the relevant clues. Our former reincarnators must have wanted to make arrangements in this plot world in advance. That makes sense. They had helped Imodin become a god, so they naturally had the strongest power in this world. So, when they were carrying out the first mummy plot, they also triggered the second plot. They even used items to strengthen Imodin's strength and triggered the conflict between Imodin and Anubis. He intervened and reaped the benefits. Now that Anubis is dead, who knows how much they have gained? There was a subtle hint of jealousy in Houghton's heart, but he knew that the reincarnators who could reverse the plot to this extent and directly intervene in the killing of God had amazing courage and strength. The kangaroos were far from being able to provoke them. But the Lord God sent us here to stir up shit and destroy their plan for the third part. So, the more variables we create in the current situation, the more chaos we create, and the more trouble we create for the previous reincarnation team, the more recognition we will get from the Lord God, and the more rewards and gains we will get. Of course, this will definitely offend the previous reincarnation team. But who cares? Anyway, I have to get my hands on the benefits first. We can talk about the rest later. With a trace of the short-sighted mentality unique to reincarnators, Houghton was not afraid of offending the former reincarnators of this world. He did not even know if he could come back alive from the next mission. Of course, he had to seize every opportunity to make himself stronger. But what he didn't know was that the former samsara traveler Chenong, whom he considered, didn't plan the details at all. Even if the Eye of Horus was damaged in Egypt, he didn't care at all. The big picture he wanted to shape couldn't be changed. As long as Imodin was alive, he wouldn't be able to suppress his desire to destroy the whole world. This was something that Chun Ong had already decided upon when he killed Ansuna. The most important reason why Chun Ong killed Ansuna was to make Imodin stare into the abyss and become a demigod full of destruction and madness. Then, by giving him half of Anubis's divinity, he would successfully make Imodin sink into the abyss forever and lead the army of the dead to destroy the world. As for the other half of the plan, Will of China, who had obtained divinity, was molded into the virtual godhood Qin First Emperor. Now that the Qin First Emperor had obtained the relevant authority of Anubis, it was no longer something that the Lord God could easily deal with. It was like a virus lurking in the Lord God system, and it had amazing strength. It was an existence that surpassed 11 stars. The samsara traveler sent by the Lord God was not qualified to touch it at all. Since there was no way to stop the Qin First Emperor, there was no way to intervene in Xinqi's plan. If they couldn't intervene in Xinqi's plan, Chen Ang's arrangement would basically not be destroyed. As for the Horus's eye organization that seemed to be the core interest of Chenong, it was actually useless. It was a dispensable arrangement in Chen Ang's plan, and it was originally sent out as a target for the Lord God to hit. Now the key layout was in the east. Even if the samsara traveler turned Egypt upside down, it would not be able to touch Chun Ang's core plan. Therefore, unless the Lord God directly sent a samsara team that had the virtual godhood Qin First Emperor to compete head-on, it would not be able to play the role of disrupting Chen Ang's plan. But this possibility was broken by Chun Ong from the beginning. Chen Ong had gone around in circles and paved the vest of Anubis for the Qin First Emperor, creating an identity that was reasonable in the evaluation of the Lord God, in order to avoid exposing their true intentions. Under this strategic deception, the Lord God system could only send some small samsara travelers to touch Chen Ang's arrangement. Most of them would be attracted by the obvious cover, the Eye of Horus. Things would eventually go according to Chen Ang's plan. The Western Imodin's undead army would rise, and the Western continent would be bathed in blood. The Eastern virtual godhood of Qin First Emperor, the Dragon Emperor, would be born, wiping out everything and shaping the Xinqian civilization. Then, the two great undead empires of the East and the West would compete with each other, triggering the third plot. Chen Ong would lead the Kyushu kingdom to reappear and recreate the Republic of China from the body of Xinqi. By that time, the reborn republic would have passed through its weakest period with the help of Xinqi. It would not be afraid, even if it faced the Lord God head-on. In the darkness of the broken underworld, Imodin was like a shadow burning with black flames. He was fusing with the divinity of Anubis, and he was growing stronger at an alarming rate. The four abominations watched in fear as he slowly lost his humanity and became an indescribable existence, just like the abyss in his eyes in the past. Imodin used the last bit of his humanity and sighed. I still failed in the end. When I stared into the abyss stared back at me. I used to think that my greatest enemy was that terrifying mortal, but in the end, I realized that it was actually me. When he killed Ansuna and destroyed me, he had already created an abyss, and for the sake of revenge, I stared at it for a long time. Until this moment, I also became an abyss. Hatred also destroyed me in the end. It was only at this moment that I realized that he wanted me to be devoured by the abyss. I used to think that he would use the legacy of Anubis to completely control me, but I was wrong. He wanted me to be uncontrollable. Blood and black tears flowed from Imodin's eyes. He watched helplessly as he was devoured by the black flames, and with the last bit of his consciousness he struggled and said, Minis kasaikamwi, Sikemabu, Sekit, I can no longer control myself, and I'm falling into the abyss. When I opened my eyes again, The one in front of you will no longer be the benevolent high priest Imodin who took you in, but a monster in the name of Imodin. Don't try to resist it. Don't crave for its pity and forgiveness. Treat it carefully. Don't talk nonsense about resistance, and let it die in its own hatred. Otherwise, it will also let the abyss devour you. Under the complicated gazes of the four, Imodin closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was only an endless abyss in his eyes. Chapter 702. In the port of London in 1920, the stench of the copper-green Thames River frothed. Most of the ships were coal-fired steamships. The Thames was busy with shipping. In the early morning sun, ships came and went, shuttling under the London Bridge. O'Connor looked at the port of the Thames River, a strong sense of uneasiness in his heart. London, which had just ended the First World War, had returned to its former prosperity. It was even more prosperous than before the war. During the First World War, the British soldiers had only lost about 700,000 people. It was less than 50% of the Irish famine caused by the British aristocrats, and less than 30% of the casualties in China's anti-Japanese war. Chenong felt that with such a small number of casualties, how could it reflect the weight of Britain's hegemony in the world? How could it reflect the sacrifices that had been made for Britain's hegemony for hundreds of years? In order to defend hegemony, more than half of Britain's population of 50 million had died. Chenong felt that it was not much. In order to gain independence, 20% of East Timor's population had died. In order to destroy the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, the Qing dynasty had slaughtered nearly 20 million people, which was close to the total number of casualties in the First World War. However, Britain's hegemony had fallen, and only 700,000 people had died. Chenong felt that this was a disgrace to Britain. When the evil Imodin's army of the dead was resurrected, only Britain had the right to represent the Western world. Only by sacrificing 2 generations of people and shedding their blood could humanity regain its glory and triumph over evil. According to Chenong's plan, Britain should fight for 14 years until the last generation died. The darkness before justice was always long, wasn't it? For the dawn that was about to come, Britain would not have to pay a painful price. It would all be worth it. For justice, Britain should persevere until the last Indian was dead. At this moment, in the House of Lords, the Speaker, who was wearing stockings and representing the authority of the House of Lords, walked into the auditorium of the House of Lords. The auditorium was already filled with members. O'Connor carefully passed through the side door and walked into the auditorium. A group of members roared at the Speaker. The British Empire should know what happened in Egypt. We have special interests in Egypt. No matter what, the British Empire will never allow the Suez Canal, which is the lifeline of Europe and can control the situation in Europe, to leave our control. There has been no news from the Suez military base for almost 2 months. Shipping has been cut off for a week, gentlemen, and the London Stock Exchange is going mad. And you still don't know what happened? Don't tell us that the telegram is true, that the undead army has taken over Suez. This is the Senate, not a place for liars and lunatics. We need accurate information from a government. The president shouted desperately. Quiet, gentlemen, please be quiet. We're dispatching troops from overseas military bases. The truth will come to light soon. In the midst of the chaos, someone stood up and shouted, if they want a war, then give them a war, no matter who they are, be it the French or the Americans. We need to know who they are. Where are diplomats stationed around the world? Why are we like blind men? We are not afraid of the enemy, but the Prime Minister can't cover our nose and ears. The Speaker shouted, our enemy is very cunning. I've invited Mr. O'Connor, a veteran who was passing by the Suez military base when it fell. He will tell us what happened there. But, gentlemen, I don't know how to judge because it's not just Mr. O'Connor's confession. He brought back a platoon of soldiers to share his story. The Speaker asked the people around O'Connor to move aside. O'Connor squeezed onto the podium with difficulty. He hesitated for a moment before saying loudly, gentlemen, what I'm about to say might be absurd and shocking, but I swear in the name of God that it's all true. Every word, every sentence, I'm willing to take responsibility for it. It all started when I was stationed at Hamunithar with the army last year. I and a battalion of men saw with our own eyes that thousands of lightning bolts fell from the sky. That Easterner was bathed in countless silver lightning bolts and turned the place into a barren land. About 5,000 feet away from me, the blazing lightning destroyed everything. What followed was a group of evil vampires. They took over the entire military base. The soldiers panicked like rabbits, and no one could organize a resistance. I stole a ship at the port and retreated from Suez with about a platoon of soldiers. After that, I came to London and reported this to Sir Edmund. O'Connor finished his report amidst the commotion. As soon as he finished, someone jumped up and said sarcastically, "So, Mr. O'Connor, do you think we're children listening to a good night story? He shouldn't be standing on the podium of the House of Lords. He should be saying this in a theater. Who knows, maybe I'll give him a tip for this wonderful story." The House of Lords roared with laughter. Another well-dressed House of Lords stood up and said, "We want to know the results of the government's investigation. It's been a month, and the government can't have done nothing. I know the Prime Minister sent an investigation team. How many ships pass through the Suez Canal every day? I don't believe that no one has brought back any information. Yes, we want to know the truth that the government is hiding." Someone shouted. The speaker hesitated for a moment, then said to the House of Lords, "Everyone, please be quiet. We will tell you the results of the investigation. Next, we will invite Deputy Commander Corbin of the investigation team. But due to some accidents, Deputy Commander Corbin might." At this moment, a person in military uniform walked out from the side door under the watchful eyes of the House of Lords. The reason for the double quotation marks was because the person was only left with a human form. His hair was thin and withered, and his skin looked like it had been skinned. Rotting bones and withered muscles were exposed, and his face was only left with a few large black holes. His teeth were exposed without the cover of his lips. His appearance made people tremble in fear. The speaker said softly, "The investigation team has a total of more than 130 people, and they also have the diplomatic support of the Empire's embassies. They can even mobilize the army." At that time, they approached the Suez Canal under the protection of a regiment. In the end, only 51 people managed to escape. On the way to London, 13 people died. Currently, only 25 people survived, and Corbin is the only one who still has the ability to speak. The rest of the people are either crazy or living a life worse than death. The speaker's words silenced the House of Lords. The House of Lords were either frightened or confused as they looked at the rotten meat on the stage. They heard him mumble incoherently, "Black fog. Devil. The undead army is coming here. Everyone is dead. Everyone is going to die." Then, the dying man suddenly trembled violently. His body twitched violently, and his eyes were filled with extreme fear. He used all his strength to shout, "They're coming. They're coming. Run. Everyone is going to die. No. God, save me." His throat suddenly swelled. His Adam's apple protruded, and his mouth opened wide. Some people were horrified to see a finger coming out of his throat, followed by a hand. A large amount of black fog suddenly came out of his body like countless wriggling insects. In the blink of an eye, he was drowned in the sword. The House of Lords was in an uproar. The House of Lords was in an uproar. The House of Lords retreated in fear, and the speaker shouted for the guards. At this time, in the fog at the mouth of the Thames River, an empty ship sailed silently towards the port. Behind the wreckage of this ghost ship, there were more unmanned ships sailing towards the Thames port. Imogen's bald head reflected the sunlight and appeared at the bow of the ship. He stood at the bow of the ship and looked down at the busy city. The navigator at the port took a small boat and approached the ship in the fog. He shouted at the ship, "Check the ship. Hurry." Because of the line of sight, he could not see anything on the ship's bow. But the long silence made him feel uneasy. He quietly put his hand on the gun at his waist. Chapter 703. Amidst the smoke, the wreckage of London Bridge was cut in two. About 200 feet of the bridge was slammed into the Tower of London. The huge tower was cut in two. The 10th-century-old building had multiple towers. It had been a fortress, an armory, a treasury, a mint, a palace, an observatory, a refuge, and a prison. It had imprisoned the two youngest sons of King Edward IV, the king before him, his cousin and brother, and the two queens of Henry VIII. But today, it had become the battlefield ruins of Imogen's invasion of London. The British Royal Navy was torn apart by the powerful dimensional collapse outside the port of London. The Archbishop of the Anglican Church had his soul devoured by Imogen. The Grim Reaper's army had massacred the British army. Even the ceremonial troops in traditional red uniforms were reduced to wreckage. They were buried under the ruins and then stood up again to fight for their enemies. Countless undead were slaughtering the living in the streets and alleys of London. London resisted for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the British Empire mobilized its world-renowned Royal Navy and brave Royal Air Force, risking their lives to take off at night and bombard the undead, just to soften the nighttime assault of the undead. But O'Connor could not forget the abyss in her eyes when the eyeless woman next to Imogen opened her eyes and looked down at the British Empire's fleet outside the port. The sudden appearance of a huge black hole and dimensional collapse twisted the battleship into a huge steel twist. The flesh and blood of the naval soldiers were like squeezed out of a tin can, turning into a pool of juicy meat paste. This was a war between the dead and the living. In the 2 most intense weeks of the war, the British Empire mobilized a total of 300,000 men, nearly 18 divisions, and mobilized 80% of the citizens of London to resist. The other 20% were not deserters, but Imhotep had converted them into his own soldiers and sent them into the war. At one point, both sides had more than 1 million men. The British side defended London with all their might, while Imogen's side benefited from the fact that cremation was not so popular during the First World War. There were trenches and fortresses everywhere. The British citizens fearlessly organized resistance in their houses, blocked the streets, and built fortifications. King George V once stood up and called on the British people to stand up and resist. He cried out, "One step back and we will be in London. We have no way back." The battlefield in London was now splattered with the blood of the British soldiers and civilians. The entire city was in ruins. The British used artillery, explosives, and bullets, but the terrifying and shameless Imogen also used bacteria, viruses, and plagues. In this war, Imogen let the rotting corpses run amok on the streets, using them to incubate a large number of flies, beetles, and fungi. At the beginning, there were only 50,000 undead who landed in London. They were all sailors and passengers who died at the Suez Canal. There were already a large number of Egyptians, but their strength was not considered strong. In the 3 days offensive, the first 3 days of contact between the British troops stationed in London and Imogen's army of the undead, other than the London harbor and most of the South and East London, they quickly eliminated a large number of enemies, pushing the front line back to the vicinity of London Bridge. It was at that time that the Tower of London became a meat grinder. Just as victory was in sight, Imogen's real attack had only just begun. The undead that invaded London carried a large number of viruses, bacteria, and fungi. After breaking through to the city in a short time, they followed Imogen's orders and quietly sank into various drinking areas and hidden spots. Decay allowed bacteria and viruses to flourish, and the viruses developed by Imogen's divine powers nurtured unimaginable horrors. In a few short days, the plague engulfed all of London, and more than 190 members of the British royal family died. Just as they boasted, Eton's death rate finally surpassed that of civilians. The death rate of Londoners was 48%, while Eton's was 90%. There was no doubt that this was the glory and honor of the British nobility, and they represented the conscience of the nobility. Of course, it also had something to do with the fact that Imogen focused on the battle. One of his 4 abominations, the mist of original sin, used to linger around Eton, and the British army that they focused on was coincidentally the place where the graduates of Eton gathered. With the joint efforts of both sides, they created a miracle that made the upper class of Britain wear mourning clothes. The soldiers and civilians who died in the plague rose again to fight for Imogen. Imogen, who had been taught a lesson by cannons and bombings, knew very well that the undead and the death guards would not be able to make humans surrender. Machetes and martial arts would not be able to compete with the armies of the imperialists, but bacteria and the plague could, and could even be enough to destroy humanity. This was what Chunong had earnestly taught him in Khufu and the pyramids of Giza. O'Connor carefully wandered through the ruins. There were many people like him. They all covered their mouths and noses with long masks that looked like the beak of a bird, and their bodies were tightly wrapped up. They had to be careful to avoid being discovered by the undead. Most of them were here to pick up scraps. It should be noted that this city, which had accumulated the fruits of Britain's colonization for hundreds of years, had immeasurable wealth. The undead did not care about gold or wealth. So this ruin was hell for the poor who had nothing, but it was also a treasure trove. Even the British government had secretly sent people to search here. Most of them had locked onto the target based on the information they received, and then guarded the area around the gold. They would then send a signal to the British Army, and they would come to the city in the form of small teams to excavate and transport the gold. Before the war, at least 10,000 tons of gold had been placed in London. Even now, the city still contained an insane amount of wealth. The government of the United Kingdom needed this wealth for military expenses and to recover London. O'Connor was this kind of official tomb raider. The British Empire had been raiding tombs all over the world for hundreds of years. Now, they could finally loot at the doorstep of London. The people of London were overjoyed, and there were often rumors of wealth. The undead under Immoden also welcomed the flesh and blood of the living to add to their meals from time to time. Now, even the skeletons, which were so rotten that only their skulls were left, knew to wander around the palace and the bank. The more luxurious the house, the more undead there were nearby. Tomb Raider O'Connor was here to find another legendary tomb raider, Indiana Jones. Mr. Indiana had recently been ordered by the government of the United Kingdom to explore the British Museum. Now, it had become one of the headquarters of the undead army. Immoden's men all said that they felt like they were home in the Egyptian relics section of the British Museum. One by one, they moved their coffins to that place. Immoden often came here to reminisce about the past. From time to time, he would touch the mummies and golden coffins and read the stone tablets and murals that the British explorers had excavated from the pyramids. During the war, it was not that the government of the United Kingdom did not think about moving the cultural relics here. Unfortunately, before they could be alerted, the army and guards here died because of the plague. O'Connor carefully avoided the bodies of the eagle men in the sky, the sharp eyes of the undead with wings, and the patrols of the jackal men with amazing martial arts. He made his way to the vast British Museum. He nimbly followed the route that he was familiar with and arrived at the library that the undead would not be interested in. He climbed to the top shelf of the library and moved his hands on two inconspicuous tomes to open a mysterious door. As soon as O'Connor entered, he felt someone pointing a gun at his head. "Mr. Jones, it's one of us." O'Connor slightly turned his body and showed the person the ID in his pocket. The person was younger than O'Connor. He was wearing a cowboy hat and a classic shirt. It was worth noting that he had an especially long whip tied around his waist. Indiana Jones took O'Connor's ID and quickly glanced at it. "I know you, Mr. O'Connor. Former British soldier, now an archaeologist, and the famous demon door opener. We didn't release Immoden." O'Connor retorted with dissatisfaction. "It was a group of Easterners who released him." "Then, Mr. O'Connor, what business do you have with me?" Indiana asked as he put away his gun. "Mr. Indiana, you became famous because you retrieved the Ark of the Sacred Covenant. At the time, the entire United Kingdom saw you as their savior. They thought that you would bring back the glory of God and help him destroy the demon Immoden. But you failed. Not only did Immoden not perish, but he also took away the power of the Arkansas. Although you destroyed a large number of the undead, it was useless. They would still crawl out of the corpses. You, who failed in the end, were not willing to let it end just like that. So you came to the British Library to look for clues about the Holy Grail. O'Connor, is that what you want to say?" Indiana Jones interrupted him impatiently. "No." O'Connor shook his head and smiled sarcastically. What I want to say is, if the Ark of the Covenant couldn't destroy the demon Immoden, can the Holy Grail? What God and Moses could not do, can Christ Jesus do? You're slandering my Lord. Indiana, Jones angrily grabbed O'Connor by the collar. O'Connor glared at him and sneered. If you want to lure Immoden here, then we can fight here. Indiana, Jones let go of O'Connor unwillingly. O'Connor said coldly, the government of the United Kingdom wants me to find you and tell you a new clue and mission, a clue that can really defeat Immoden. The group of Australians who searched for the Ark of the Covenant with you provided a very crucial clue. I've said it before, there was a group of Easterners who played a key role in Imhotep's death. They were the ones who awakened Imhotep and destroyed him. Now, the Australian called Horton has provided a crucial clue. That group of Easterners also participated in the crucial battle where Imhotep killed Anubis and transformed into a demon. They even took away half of the divinity. This is our only hope to defeat Immoden. Only by finding the divinity that the Asians took away can we have a way to kill the demon Immoden. According to reliable sources, this group of Asians brought the divinity to China to resurrect a tyrant called the Dragon Emperor, awaken the undead army of the Dragon Emperor, stop Immoden's invasion, and let that ancient country rule the world again. We must stop their evil actions, take back the divinity, and bury Immoden. Then what is my goal? Indiana Jones frowned slightly and said, the Dragon Emperor is buried in a huge mausoleum. He was the first emperor of China. The legend of him being cursed is vaguely related in the history books of China. It is said that a fairy named Ziyuan sealed the tyrant Dragon Emperor who wanted to conquer the world. If that group wants to resurrect the Dragon Emperor, they will definitely go to his mausoleum. So, the government of the United Kingdom wants me to go to the mausoleum of the Dragon Emperor and help them take the divinity of Anubis to prevent the Dragon Emperor from resurrecting? Not you us. O'Connell pointed at himself. Me, an archaeologist from the United States called Laura, and an explorer called John Adams Gates are also on this journey. In the United States, the young female archaeologist Laura said to the American government officials sitting in front of her, what? You want us to explore the mausoleum of the Dragon Emperor that is far away in China? She flew down from the cliff and nimbly rolled 2 steps before landing on the ground. She untied the rope on her body and asked in confusion, why? In China, Partridge Whistle sighed deeply and said, Hare Hill Seal, touch the golden talisman, move the mountains, and unload the ridges. Dragon seeking formula. Human lighting the candle, ghost blowing the lamp, survey the inverted bucket, find the star peak. Mercury spot, raise the bright artifact, go to countless dragon pavilions and treasure palaces. Dark sunken coffin, bronze outer coffin, don't get close if you are not strong. Vertical burial pit, Xia tomb, move the mountains and unload the ridges. Red clothes fierce, smiling corpse. Ghost laugh is better than ghost cry. Did you hear that? Vertical burial pit, Xia tomb. I have to walk around when I hear it. You actually want me to touch the mausoleum of the first emperor? Chen Yulo, are you trying to push me to my death? The person sitting in front of him was called Chen Yulo. He was born into a family of grave robbers and was the leader of 3 generations of robbers. His father was the helmsman of the Unload Ridge Bandits. He had a pair of eyes that could see through mud, recognize the color of grass, and find hidden treasures. Although he was still young, his ability was already extraordinary. Hearing Partridge Whistle's refusal, he was not angry. He only smiled and said, Yang Xiao, do you have a red birthmark on your back that looks like an eye? Legend has it that the exquisite queen's eyes are connected to an unimaginable world that is the Ghost Cave. After her death, a tribe called the Ghost Cave was cursed for generations, and their people would die suddenly at a young age. The cursed people all have an eye on their back that symbolizes the Ghost Cave. Yang Xiao, you can't fool me. You are the people of the Ghost Cave. But now, another pair of eyes like this has appeared in the West. Your destiny has ushered in the dawn of liberation. Only one thing in the mausoleum of the first emperor can save you. Otherwise, when the woman in the West with eyes connected to the Ghost Cave gets closer and closer, your entire tribe will be dragged into the Ghost Cave, never to be reincarnated. Partridge Whistle was silent for a long time before he said, Okay, I will go with you. Chapter 704. 1920 was the third year after the end of the First World War and the eighth year after the establishment of the Republic of China. In July of this year, the Zhili Anhui War broke out in China. Wu Peifu tried to capture Duan Chirui, but failed. Duan Chirui of the Anhui faction was defeated. On July 17th, floods flooded the four counties of Zhejiang, Jiangzhou, Wenling, and others. The disaster was unprecedented in 60 years. On December 16th, 280,000 people died in Haiyuan, Gansu, Ningxia Haiyuan earthquake today. It was under these circumstances that Partridge Whistle and Chen Yulo came to Xian, Shangxi. Chen Yulo was a well-known figure in the Lulin society. In every dynasty and every generation, only when the world was in chaos would the shelling bandits live in the mountains and rivers. They would dig up tombs and break the dragon vein of the royal tombs. During peaceful times, the government was in charge. China had always been strict with household registration checks. A large group of refugees like the shelling bandits would wander around and become a thorn in the side of the government sooner or later. Therefore, it was only when the world was in chaos and the vagrants became bandits that these shelling bandits could change their appearance and put on the identity of the Lulin. Usually, they would roam the mountains and forests, and there would be troops who would travel everywhere to observe the landscape of the mountains and rivers. Once they found a great tomb, they would gather and rob the tomb clean. Chen Yulo's father was the head of the shelling bandits. He controlled the famous horse bandits in Hunan, Shaanxi, Two Lakes, and several other provinces. He was a big figure in the 3 provinces and 4 rivers. Partridge Whistle came from the Zagrama tribe. In order to break the curse caused by the shaman in the tribe who used the jade to peek into the virtual space, these people painstakingly searched for the Mukin pearl that appeared for a fleeting moment during the time of Emperor Wu of Han. In order to find the Great Tomb, they formed a branch of the inverted fighting sect, the Banshan Taoist. After thousands of years of inheritance, Partridge Whistle was probably the last Banshan Taoist in their tribe. When he was young, he learned this skill from a tomb raider whose name was Liao Chun. He became a master of 2 great inheritances. Chen Yulo knew about his skill and insisted on bringing him on board. Chen Yulo and Partridge Whistle were in the territory near the ancient city of Xian. They found a clue at the northern foot of Mount Li, the shore of the ancient Wei River, east of Lintong County and Ma. Partridge Whistle saw that the terrain here was very open. The mountain range was symmetrical on both sides, the forest was lush, the valleys and peaks intersected. The mountain range was slightly curved in the south of Mount Li, like a blooming lianhua. The imperial mausoleum was in the middle of Mount Li, surrounded by peaks and ridges. It was one with the entire Mount Li like a lotus bud in the middle. According to feng shui, this place was the remnant of the Qinling dragon vein. Partridge Whistle had been traveling all over Mount Li these past few days. Only then did he have the confidence to tell Chen Yulo. The first emperor had the ability to conquer heaven and earth. He was the ruler who unified the 4 seas. Although his second generation died early, his burial place must be the Dragon Vein True Cave, the main vein of Daqin. This kind of Dragon Vein True Cave cannot be hidden easily. That is why so many imperial mausoleums have been robbed. The Taizu Mountain of the first emperor's imperial mausoleum carries the Qinling dragon vein through Mount Li. The Wei River flows from the Qinling Mountains to Xianyang. Layer by layer, it repeatedly opens the tents, passes through the gorge, gathers its qi, and travels to the shore of the ancient Wei River. Then it enters the protruding cave where the star's sand intersects with the water and the yin and yang match. The imperial mausoleum is the imperial mausoleum. There is an open plain east of Lintong County to Ma. The imperial mausoleum is located at the fetus, nurturing, longevity, crown, and belt areas. It should be the most appropriate location to locate it from here. Good. You are worthy of being Partridge Whistle, who has 2 branches. Chen Yulo was overjoyed. Since you have already located the earth vein, then it is time for us Xianling branch to show our skills. Since ancient times, the Xianling strongmen were skilled in equipment and cooperation. Even the Qin Emperor's underground palace was not difficult for them to create a tunnel that led directly to the main burial chamber. However, what the two of them did not expect was that although the main structure of the first emperor's imperial mausoleum still followed feng shui geography, after Ying Long and the others' crazy modifications, the underground palace was so vast that it could no longer be called an underground palace, but an underground city. The entire first emperor's imperial mausoleum was embedded in Mount Li, covering an area of more than 200 square kilometers. It was built into a complete underground city by the construction robots. It was really unimaginable for the two of them. As for O'Connor, Indiana Jones, Countess Laura, and the others overseas, the distance from London to Shaanxi was very high. Fortunately, the government of the United Kingdom knew the importance of the matter and the urgency of the situation. On top of that, Imogen burned and killed along the way and swept across the British Isles. Countless people were killed, forcing a few of them to travel through the night and night. All the British colonies overseas gave them their full support. At the beginning of the 20th century, they set a record for a flight around the world. In just 10 days, they landed outside an airport temporarily requisitioned by the British consulate in Wuhan. In these 10 days, Imogen's Army of the Dead had already reached Cambridge, which was only a dozen kilometers away from Coventry. The entire United Kingdom was in a crisis of national annihilation. The Wuhan Council did not dare to delay and arranged for them to board the plane to Shaanxi that very night. O'Connor looked at the vast fertile land outside the window and seemed to have a lot on his mind. Indiana Jones had already asked for the key information in detail on the way. He spread out the map on the table and pointed in the direction of Mount Li. He said, although London fell and most of the precious historical information about China was left in the British Museum, after my infiltration and excavation and the government's investigation, we have already locked the Dragon Emperor's tomb in this area. O'Connor nodded and said, don't worry about the manpower. The council has already reached an agreement with one of the biggest warlords in China, Mr. Pefyu Wu. We have also reached an agreement with the Guoming government in the south. In China, we will be unimpeded. The empire requires the warlords in both the north and south of China to give us the greatest convenience. For this, we have to pay a certain price in diplomacy. Laura frowned and said, are you sure that there won't be a strong protest from the media and newspapers if we go to dig up the tomb of their oldest emperor? I mean, China is becoming more and more nationalistic. I'm afraid that their people will not agree to let us dig up their ancient monuments. O'Connor sneered and said, the British Empire will not care about the protests of their people. This journey is related to the safety of our country. No matter which warlord, they will not be able to bear the consequences of the imperial government's wrath. They will obediently take us there. As for those newspapers, if they don't shut up, they will never be able to open their mouths again. No one will care about the protests of the dead. The Wuhan consulate informed us that when they received the order from the British Prime Minister, they had already arranged for people to go to Xi'an first. They have contacted a group of China's civilian explorers to help us go down to the tomb and find Imogen's divinity. There is also a battalion of British Army with us. They are responsible for protecting us and supervising and controlling the entire excavation camp. We need about 5,000 people to be responsible for the excavation and exploration. It is too dangerous without an army to suppress it. 5,000 people? Laura exclaimed in disbelief. Is there a pyramid buried there? Chapter 705. The next morning, O'Connor and his group came to the construction site at the foot of Mount Li. The place had been protected by the people Feng Yuxiang had sent. The British Council in Wuhan had sent someone to contact Feng Yuxiang. Previously, Yan Xiangwen had suddenly committed suicide not long after he became the Shaanxi military governor. So Feng Yuxiang, the commander of the 11th Division of the Direct Army, had taken over as the Shaanxi military governor. Feng Yuxiang was the military chief of the Northern Ocean warlords in Shaanxi. When he received O'Connor and the others in the Shaanxi military governor's office, he was dressed in a soldier's uniform. Due to the fact that he was a soldier, he always liked to put on a simple and hard-working look. However, he was also a devout Christian. When he received the foreign believers, he even wore a cross hanging on his chest, making him look neither fish nor fowl. In fact, at this time, believing in Christianity had once become a trend in China. The warlords took pride in believing in Christianity. Deep down, it was nothing more than currying favor with the foreigners. In the mess of the warlords in China, the words of the foreigners were more effective than the president of the Northern Ocean. Putting everything else aside, if the British were to loosen their grip and give Feng Yuxiang a discount on the interest on the arms and loans, it would be worth it for him to curry favor with them. Feng Yuxiang entertained the foreign archaeologists with great enthusiasm. He courteously invited O'Connor, Laura, and the others to pray in the small church at his home. In the name of discussing doctrines and the Bible, he became familiar with these foreigners. Although the British had suffered a heavy blow at this time, firstly, Feng Yuxiang might not know about it. Secondly, even if Feng Yuxiang knew about it, the British Empire still had some assets. Even the French and the Germans did not dare to look down on the British who controlled the sea power, let alone the China warlords. Although the family business in England had failed, they were still nobler than the inferior Asians. O'Connor and the others all thought so. From their point of view, only Europe had culture and civilization, and Christianity was a universal value. The British were first-class civilized people, the Europeans were second-class civilized people, the Americans were low-class civilized people, the Japanese were civilized barbarians, and the Chinese were at best a little better than the African natives. They were classified as half-civilized barbarians, and the religious Chinese were a completely civilized breed of civilized barbarians, a little nobler than the rest. Therefore, when Feng Yuxiang revealed his identity as a disciple, they still had a good impression of him. However, when the two sides began to discuss the specific division of interests, the good impression was immediately thrown to the back of their minds. The British deputy director who led the way had a cold expression and said with a hint of a command, "We request that the Northern Ocean come forward to protect our archaeological team and suppress the local bandits and rebels. They will facilitate our activities here as much as possible." Feng Yuxiang laughed and said, "We must protect the legitimate interests of your country, but we can't betray the interests of China. Right? Right now, the people on the streets are not giving you a good reputation for this archaeological activity. Qin First Emperor was a great emperor of China. His tomb was also an important property and treasure of the Chinese government. If your country forcibly takes over its archaeological activities, I'm afraid that public opinion will be unfavorable to the United Kingdom. You know, there's also the group of rebels in the south causing trouble. If we, the Northern Ocean, give in to England, the group of rebels in the south will definitely besiege the Northern Ocean in public opinion. The cultural and educational circles will also strongly oppose this behavior of infringing on China's treasures and reselling China's cultural relics." The deputy director's eyes turned cold, and he said lightly, "The government of the United Kingdom has no intention of robbing China's cultural relics." As soon as he said this, Feng Yuxiang cursed in his heart. "You're lying." The Dunhuang scriptures from Gansu province from more than 10 years ago were not displayed in the British Museum. There are so many treasures in the China Pavilion. Were they given to you by the people of China? But with all due respect, the Chinese government does not have the conditions to excavate and preserve cultural relics. Your country has no archaeology at all. Your country's history and culture can only be recognized by the international academic community under the development and protection of the United Kingdom. If we hand it over to you, it will only cause these precious cultural relics to flow into the international cultural relics market, causing inevitable damage and loss. This archaeological operation is of great importance. My country hopes to have a battalion of embassy guards at the archaeological site to protect our country's archaeologists and work normally. At the same time, we also need General Feng to provide reasonable help, such as guides and excavators. For the sake of the friendship between our two countries, General Feng should carefully consider our proposal. In order to force Feng Yuxiang to agree in the shortest time possible, the deputy director had to violate the British diplomatic circle's usual method of stirring up **T. He used a stiff threat to make Feng Yuxiang relent. Sure enough, when the deputy director's tone contained a hidden threat, Feng Yuxiang agreed to all the requirements of the United Kingdom despite his ugly expression. The deputy consul knew that the matter of bribing Feng Yuxiang later would be settled by them. The most important thing now was to let O'Connor and the others start working. Arriving at the foot of Mount Lee, Laura saw a well-organized excavation site. She was surprised to see a few people wearing hemp shoes and dressed as grave robbers. They were currently inserting a semi-cylindrical shovel into the ground. The leader of the group was an old man with grizzled hair. He was still holding onto his whip. His braid was coiled up on his head as he carefully inspected the soil that had been brought up. O'Connor walked behind Laura and asked in surprise, "What are these China people doing?" "Shoo." Laura interrupted him and whispered, "I've heard from archaeologists who came to China that China's explorers and grave robbers use an archaeological tool called the Luoyang shovel to bring out soil that was tens of feet deep for analysis and inspection. They would observe the color and smell of the soil to determine its age, geological characteristics, and the burial soil. Experienced China explorers could even use them to determine if someone had excavated this land on a large scale hundreds of years ago." "That's amazing," Laura exclaimed. "The art of geomancy. The most important thing is to taste the water from the soil." The old man with gray hair whispered to Chen Yulo, who was beside him, "I've tasted 17 ancient wells around here and confirmed that the water here is soft and sweet. It's 30% gold water and 70% silver water. It can be said to be rich and long-lasting. It's also suitable for the soil and weighs 8 taels. It's very auspicious." "Then why are you frowning?" Chen Yulo was puzzled. "It's the soil brought out by the Luoyang shovel. It's very strange. I've already explored the upper layer of the tomb of the first emperor, but if it's according to what I've found, the tomb of the Qin emperor has soil marks for 12,000 steps back and 30,000 steps to the left and right. And the top layer of the soil is greenish-black, which is yang green soil. Yang green soil often appears in the tombs of the Warring States period. But I've only seen this color of yang green soil in the tomb of a noble of the Qin dynasty. At that time, your father was the leader. He led us to the tomb at the foot of the jagged mountains. At that time, we noticed the strangeness of this copper-colored soil. Later, when we broke through the robber's hole in the soil, an unimaginable horror happened. Later, we learned that this copper-colored yang green soil is also called hibernating dragon soil. This yang green soil needs to be mixed with human blood and mashed together with the yang green soil excavated from the ancient tomb. A soil ball has to weigh 9 taels and 9 parts. It's mixed with goo insects and foreign insect eggs and poured on the outer layer of the tomb soil. There are 8 kinds of goo insect eggs mixed in the hibernating dragon soil, plus the eggs of a foreign insect called goo insect. The goo insect hatches when it sees the wind. After the soil is covered, if it's more than 3 feet deep, with the nourishment of the underground in spring, then the goo insect in the soil will slowly lay eggs and die. This kind of foreign insect has a very strange temperament. It needs to parasitize goo insects to reproduce. The adult insects need to parasitize goo insects to borrow the goo insects to lay eggs. At that time, the eggs laid by the goo insects will carry the goo insect eggs and goo insect eggs. The goo insects hatched together with the goo insects will parasitize the next generation of goo insects in the shortest time. In order to let themselves parasitize goo insects to reproduce, the goo insects will secrete a kind of colloid like propolis before they die to protect the goo insect eggs. After they reach adulthood, they need to face the wind to grow wings. So after the first batch of hatched goo insect eggs, the goo insects that grow will die because they can't see the wind after protecting the goo insect eggs in the soil. But the goo insect eggs they parasitize can be maintained for thousands of years without losing vitality. Only when they see the wind, the secretion protecting the goo insects will disappear, prompting the goo insects to hatch. The old man sighed and said, "When we robbed the tomb of the Qin aristocrat, because we dug up the soil, the 2,000-year-old goo insect eggs inside were exposed to the wind and decayed into countless goo insects as fine as dust. Unknowingly, they parasitized in our bodies. As he said this, the old man carefully crushed the bronze-colored soil that was lifted up by the Luoyang shovel for Chen Yulo to see. Some large goo insects the size of sesame seeds, and small ones that could not be seen fell from the soil. Chen Yulo's expression changed. He said in a low voice, "So there is this kind of soil under our feet? Then when we dig up a robber's hole, how much of the soil will the goo insects in it revive?" The old man thought for a moment, then raised his head and said, "As the wind blows in the robber's hole, it will probably alarm the goo insects in the surrounding area. These goo insects like Een and Hatyong. Normally, they will not appear in areas where the sun shines, but very quickly, they will be everywhere in the robber's hole. When we dig into the robber's hole, it will be like entering a worm's hole. Starting from digging to the hibernating dragon soil, it will only take 3 minutes for the goo insects to revive and breed. The larger the area we dig, the more goo insects will be alarmed. This is the first layer of defense of the first emperor's tomb." Chen Yulo sighed and said, "With the great talent of the first emperor, who knows how much more danger he will face this time?" O'Connor looked at the few people who were staring blankly at the Luoyang shovel under their feet and laughed coldly. "I think we don't have to look forward to that group of Chinese. They are ignorant and lazy, uncivilized people. We don't have much time left. We have to quickly dig up the coffin of the Dragon Emperor and stop those Easterners from reviving him." Laura objected. "I think we should listen to the opinions of the local explorers." Chapter 706. Seeing that O'Connor had left by himself, Laura did not take his words to heart. She went straight up and greeted Chen Yulo in broken Chinese. "Hello. Do any of you speak English? I'm an archaeologist from England. My name is Laura." As a most outstanding female archaeologist in Britain, Laura could speak 7 languages. Although her Chinese wasn't very good, she could still communicate with the Chinese people with some difficulty. On the contrary, Chen Yulo was shocked by this foreign woman who could speak Chinese. He immediately reacted and asked in Shaanxi dialect, "Miss Laura, did you understand what we were talking about just now?" Chen Yulo did not know how much these foreigners understood. Now that he thought about it, it was really careless of him to talk about his old profession in front of these foreigners. Fortunately, the shelling bandits were used to using Shaanxi dialect. A sly light flashed in his eyes, and he used this to test Laura. China was a vast country, and there were many different dialects. China did not dare to say that it could understand all of them, let alone a foreigner like Laura. Therefore, Laura naturally showed a puzzled expression and said with difficulty, "Can you speak slower? I don't understand." Chen Yulo was experienced and could naturally read people's expressions. He felt that Laura did not seem to be lying, so he slightly relaxed. In order to take care of Laura, he deliberately slowed down and explained in official Chinese, "Miss Laura, when Marshal Feng from the Northern Ocean contacted us, he did not say that foreigners would be joining the archaeological team. Although we are only hired by Marshal Feng, we also know that China's treasures should not fall into the hands of outsiders. Although we are lowly people, we also know that it is a big crime to deceive your ancestors. So, Miss Laura, please forgive us. We cannot let you enter the construction site." Laura vaguely understood half of it and tried her best to explain, "We will not steal the cultural relics left by your ancestors. We only want one thing inside. That is, someone stole something from our country and put it in here. That's why we need your help to bring that thing out. Otherwise, not only the British but the kind people all over the world will face a huge disaster." Laura struggled to explain in Hunan Mandarin. Halfway through her explanation, O'Connor, who was far away, turned around and called out to her, saying that he had found something important. She could only end it simply, "My companion is calling me, but please believe me, we need to build trust and cooperation between us. Goodbye." After saying this, Laura turned around and left the construction site. The gray-haired old man moved closer to Chen Yulo's ear and whispered, "What should we do?" "Young master, if the British drive Feng Yuxiang's people to block this place, we will have to work for others, and now the foreigners are also involved. The mausoleum of the first emperor is dangerous and unpredictable, and Feng Yuxiang and the foreigners are eyeing it covetously. Should we still do this job? Feng Yuxiang invited us, but he never mentioned that the foreigners would also be involved. It can be seen that they are up to no good. They want to use us to crack the mechanisms of the first emperor's mausoleum and the dangerous geomancy. We also want to build a plank road in the open and move in the dark, bypassing their sight, sneaking into the main chamber of the tomb first and fishing out a lot of good things. We, the Ridge's excavator, have always only been after money and goods, regardless of good or evil. Qin Yulo's eyes flickered, and he hesitated. The first emperor's mausoleum is huge, and it is close to Xin City. Normally, we would not dare to touch the tiger's buttocks, but now that we have Feng Yuxiang's support, we can use a lot of manpower to dig up the first emperor's mausoleum. This is really a rare opportunity. As for the Westerners, how could they understand the mysteries of Chinese feng shui when they enter the tomb? At that time, if we want them to live, they will live, and if we want them to die, they will die. If we want them to come to China, they will run into a big rice dumpling. Now, tell everyone not to move, so as not to alarm the hidden dragon below. There are poisonous insect eggs everywhere. Once they all hatch in the wind, people within a radius of dozens of miles will die. What if the foreigners act rashly? The old man said worriedly, "Tell everyone to stay away from the foreigners. A battalion of British is not easy to deal with. If they don't move, I will frame them once. If they move, they will be asking for trouble. Tell people to prepare more kerosene and firewood. When the time comes, we will set up the fire dragon formation on the high ground in the east, and naturally we will not have to worry. I will go and discuss with Partridge Whistle now. Don't move. If Feng Yuxiang urges you to come down, just say that we need to worship the god when we open the tomb, and we will not start work if we don't worship." When Laura returned to the tent, she heard O'Connor say, "Now the British Empire is in a stalemate." Today's telegram said that the plague has swept through all the counties in England, and even Ireland has been infected. The group of dead people has already reached Birmingham, and the British Empire's survival is at stake. We do not have time to work according to the normal archaeological process. We must make progress as soon as possible. O'Connor's eyes flashed, and he suddenly said, "Now, there are 3 tons of explosives in the camp, and with the support of the engineering battalion, we can completely open a passage in the less important part of the mausoleum below and use the explosives to lift the soil covering the upper layer of the underground palace. This way, we can excavate the entire mausoleum in only 2 days." Hearing this, Laura was shocked and hurriedly objected. "Impossible! This will cause immeasurable damage to the ruins below. If the worst happens, and the underground palace collapses and is buried, then the time to clean up the underground palace will be delayed for at least 3 months. The risk is too great. We should get the support of the local explorers and make a more reasonable plan." After listening to the tit-for-tat between the two, Indiana Jones hesitated for a moment. He agreed with O'Connor's decision, but Laura's words were also very reasonable. If the explosives failed to lift the soil layer and create a gap in the underground palace, and instead cause the underground palace to collapse, then the whole operation would suffer a heavy blow. Although Jones did not know the saying in China, "More haste, less speed," he still understood similar principles. If we spend a lot of money to bribe General Feng and let him send a large number of workers to excavate this mausoleum at all costs, then the efficiency should be increased to a level that we can accept. Indiana Jones's meaning was very clear. The so-called at all costs was to let the Chinese work at the risk of their lives, just like the East China Road and the American West Railroad, to let the Chinese do the most dangerous work, using human lives to pave a path to the tomb. Instead of studying the traps and mechanisms, they would use living people to test it and let the Chinese take the risk to dismantle it. There was one more thing Mr. Indiana did not say. This way, they could safely supervise the work of the Chinese without risking their lives to explore. O'Connor rejected the idea without hesitation. The Chinese are not trustworthy, just like the Indians. They can't bear this level of responsibility, and they will make a mess. In this case, we should let the trustworthy British solve the problem. In the end, they discussed and decided to carry out the 2 plans at the same time. On one side, O'Connor would command the British engineers to find out the general shape of the underground palace, blast a hole to the side of the tomb, and then detonate it in a directional direction to create a relatively large gap. On the other hand, Indiana would let the Chinese civilian workers continue to dig down to get more information about the underground palace. If O'Connor succeeded, then the Chinese civilian workers could enter the tomb to explore the underground palace first, and the British Army would be responsible for inspection and security. If O'Connor failed, they could also enter the tomb from the other side of the underground palace. Coincidentally, the area of the underground palace that the Luoyang shovel had dug was at the edge of the British Army's camp. They could blast a tunnel from the back of the camp and then detonate it. O'Connor commanded the engineers to quickly dig a tunnel from the side of the sealed earth to the underground palace, while Laura and Indiana went to contact Chun Yulo to continue the excavation. The shelling bandits' camp had been moved to the high ground on the east side. In front of the camp's gate, Partridge Whistle and Chun Yulo were having a heated argument. Chun Yulo explained, "We didn't know that the foreigners were involved, and we didn't know that there was a foreign army watching over us. Besides, this place is full of traps, and we can easily investigate them. It's not difficult to kill all the foreigners. Brother Yang, why do you have to do this?" Partridge Whistle said solemnly, "We, the mountain-moving Taoists, are only here for the precious medicine, not for wealth, let alone to associate with the foreigners. Forgive me for not being able to explore the first emperor's mausoleum with Brother Chun." Chun Yulo persuaded, "Partridge Whistle, listen to me. The foreigners forcing Feng Yuxiang to dig the first emperor's mausoleum is a foregone conclusion. Feng Yuxiang is a cunning old fox, and he tricked me to come and pave the way for them. After I found out, I was also very angry. But even if we are not willing to be used by Feng Yuxiang, does he not have anyone in his hands? Most likely, he is still forcing the people to open the tomb for him. Brother Yang, do you know the danger of the hibernating dragon soil? If it weren't for us, who would be able to protect the people digging here? At that time, when the goo insect attacks, will it be a warlord like Feng Yuxiang who dies? Won't it be those innocent people? And there are countless rare treasures in the first emperor's mausoleum. Even if Partridge Whistle's people can't find the Phoenix Gall, it may still be here. If the British really get the Phoenix Gall, will you, Brother Yang, be willing? Treasures of heaven and earth belong to the virtuous. Instead of letting the foreigners get the relics of the first emperor, it's better to let us get it." As soon as Chun Yulo's voice fell, they heard a loud noise coming from the west. In an instant, everyone's expression changed. Chun Yulo even stomped his foot and said, "F***CK. The foreigners actually used explosives. Are they tired of living? Damn it." Everyone knew what was buried under their feet. It was thousands of acres of high-density goo insect eggs, which would rot in the wind. If the explosion really alarmed these goo insects, there would be hundreds of millions of them. Chun Yulo started running towards the high ground. As he ran, he ordered, "Quickly open a trench along the high ground, pour the kerosene in it, and set up the fire dragon formation. Otherwise, if the goo insects are alarmed, hundreds of millions of them will gather and fly over the ground like a black cloud. If they land on the ground, they will die instantly. These goo insects like Een and hate Yang. Only a wall of fire can block them." When he ran to the top of the high ground, he saw a halo rising from the explosion site. It was like a colorful circle, and in the halo, there was a huge black hole swallowing the flying dust. It was as if a whirlpool had suddenly collapsed and formed under the dust. Chun Yulo was proficient in the art of listening to the mountain and distinguishing the dragon. By listening to the wind, thunder, and the echo of the explosion, he could determine how big and how deep the tomb was. However, at this moment, the echo of the explosion was long and slow. It was as if there was a vast space that went straight into the belly of Mount Lee, almost hollowing out Mount Lee. If this was the underground palace of the first emperor, it would be shocking. Chun Yulo saw the old man rushing over. He pointed at the colorful light and asked, "Sir, is that the chi of the earth leaking from the dragon vein?" The old man who had experienced the hibernating dragon soil in the Qin aristocrat's tomb had a huge change in expression. He pressed down on Chun Yulo's head to hide and said, It's a pig's block, bullsh asterisk T. The few of them hurriedly poured kerosene into the trench and ignited the fire. Other than the path at the front of the camp for the workers and peasants to take refuge on the mountain, there was only a wall of fire in the rest of the place. The fire rose 3 feet high. The camp was set up by Chinulo. The wind blew from the back of the wall of fire. It was very safe for them to hide here. Chapter 707. This old man used to be a scholar in the former Qing dynasty, and later became the military advisor of the Shelling Mountain Bandits. His family name was Bai, and the bandits called him Commander Bai. Everyone knew that when he was a scholar, he had read many strange books that were looked down upon by scholars. Later, he followed Old Bandit Chief to travel all over the country and had seen many things. When they heard him talk about the dangers of the 5-colored poisonous fog, they all felt guilty. As soon as Commander Bai finished speaking, they saw 2 military vehicles rushing out of the British military camp not far from where the 5-colored poisonous fog landed. The military camp was only a few miles away from the high ground where they were hiding. In the middle was the 1,000 Li Ming Hall of the Qin Emperor's mausoleum. It was a flat piece of land, so although the 2 vehicles rushed forward with all their might, regardless of whether there was a road or not, as if there was something terrible chasing behind them, they could still rush all the way. When Commander Bai saw the 2 fleeing British military vehicles, he said in horror, "Those foreigners are really lucky to be able to grasp a chance of survival in this kind of dead end." He didn't know that the military vehicle in the lead was full of protagonists with the strongest destiny. Also, the venomous insects in the air that gathered the colorful gas were not the feng shui secret techniques of the ancient people, but real high-tech products. The hibernating dragon soil was indeed something. It was a combination of the secret feng shui techniques of the Yin-Yang necromancers and the witchcraft techniques of the Chu kingdom during the Warring States period. Combining the qi of medicinal stones with the yin qi of feng shui, it cultivated a land of insects. The Book of Changes said, "The goo of the Godfather, there is no blame, and the end is good." It also said, "There is wind at the foot of the mountain. The goo, the gentleman uses it to inspire the people." During the Warring States period, the art of feng shui was not yet perfected. It was a branch under the yin-yang technique. However, the Tao existed before the technique was completed. In the yin-yang school, necromancers used the yin-yang technique to control feng shui. It had another wonderful effect. Compared to the feng shui perfected by Lai Bai and Lu Qingyi in the later generations, it was closer to the primitive and simple origin of feng shui. With the Book of Changes as the general principle, it had another kind of wild and primitive feeling. The hibernating dragon soil from the mountain wind goo was like this. In feng shui, mountains were called mausoleums, and the dragon veins that controlled the yin and yang hubs were called mountains. The dragon vein system of the first emperor's tomb was a mountain, but there was wind under the mountain, so there was some decay and decay. This logic was like how a system was perfect and exquisite. It needed to gradually accumulate the aura of decay when it operated. Even with the prestige of a feudal dynasty, it had to constantly breed internal corruption and cause decay. The mountain was tall, and the wind and clouds were invading. The external force that eroded the mountain was the wind, and the internal force that acted on the mountain was the goo. There was wind under the mountain, and the wind blew the goo. This was the principle of the goo image in the 64 hexagrams of the Book of Changes. It referred to the cause of internal decay caused by the erosion of external forces after a system operated for a long time. Necromancers used the art of feng shui and the way that the voodoo insects were sterile to calculate the situation of the wind goo in the mountain terrain of the mausoleum. Using the terrain as the earth and the soil as the earth, they placed the aura of decay in a kind of strange soil to nourish the goo and form the mountain wind goo hexagram. They used the aura of decay in feng shui to raise the poisonous insects in the hibernating dragon soil. Usually, these goo insects could not only resolve the aura of decay in feng shui, but they could also be used as a defensive measure to prevent the tomb robbers from peeping into the mausoleum. The ingenuity of its use depended on one's heart. Commander Bai, with her own desire for wealth, speculated the bearing of the predecessors and thought that the hibernating dragon soil was a vicious trap to trap the tomb robbers later. She really underestimated the bearing of the predecessors and misunderstood the beauty of this secret feng shui technique. However, the hibernating dragon soil in the mausoleum of the Qin Emperor was completely different from the hibernating dragon soil in the yin-yang technique. The Xianqin civilization was a technological civilization disguised as a cultivation civilization. Originally, there was indeed a small piece of hibernating dragon soil in the mausoleum of the first emperor. However, when the first emperor's mausoleum was transformed by Yinglong, it had been completely burned by high-energy lasers. Not to mention the goo insects, even bacteria, could not survive. The bionic hibernating dragon soil was actually a combination of the Xianqin nanomachine bionic insects and the goo insect feng shui environmental mimicry system. As an experimental site for the immortalization of biological mimicry technology in the mausoleum of the first emperor, it was responsible for reverse engineering the biochemical technology that the first emperor had cracked in the war against the plague and reintegrated it with the Republic's scientific and technological system to carry out adaptive transformation. Using the mimicry nanomechanic insects to imitate the evolutionary system of the plague Zerg, the nanomechanic insects were set up as an experimental site for adaptive transformation and evolution. However, the nanomechanic insects were no less dangerous than the goo insects. Those nanomachines, which were as small as insects, had already adapted and evolved as many as 8 or 9 types. They were as small as dust particles, only tens of nanometers in size. When they were commanded by the collective consciousness of each nanomechanic insect, they could be the best medicine, but when they became vicious, they were not much better than the most terrible poison. Not to mention anything else, as long as these nanomachines entered the human nerve cells and played a slightly blocking or interfering role, it could really paralyze or die. The larger nanomachines, when gathered together, could emit heat that could burn gold and melt iron, destroy cells, and turn people into pus. They could even synthesize high molecular toxic substances and radiation energy at any time. These bionic biochemical weapons, not to mention the backward technology and army of the 20th century, would not be a threat even if they were put in the interstellar era to fight a landing on a planet. The two military vehicles had just escaped for about a mile when Chen Yulo saw a cloud of colorful gas rising from behind them, gathering into a circle of light in the sky like a peach blossom. He did not know that it was the scattering effect of the translucent nanomachines and sunlight. Just like the rainbow near a waterfall, it was a normal optical phenomenon. He only thought that it was something like the gorgeous miasma that the poisonous flood dragons and pythons breathed in and out in the deep mountains and valleys. Chen Yulo felt a chill run down his spine, and his heart palpitated with fear. Commander Bai whispered in Chen Yulo's ear, "Young master, those foreigners are coming with poisonous creatures. Although we have the protection of the fire dragon formation, we don't know how many strange things this kind of poisonous creature bred in feng shui is. Whiff, boss, you better make a decision quickly. As long as young master gives the order, us brothers will blow up those 2 vehicles on the road and let them go to hell far away from us." A thought flashed in Chen Yulo's mind, and he had already made a decision. Those foreigners are not Chinese. They deserve to die. Brothers, let's make their vehicles cripple. Partridge Whistle, who was next to him, heard this. Without saying anything, he stepped on a gun that was placed next to him, and with a skillful force under his feet, he brought the gun up. He pulled the bolt and pressed the butt of the gun against his left shoulder. With one look, it was obvious that he was an expert in marksmanship. Without moving the military vehicle, the mountain and his eyes formed a line. The muzzle was slightly raised and then slightly moved up along with the wind. When the car was only 800 meters away from them, he shot the front wheel of the car. Seeing this, Chen Yulo's eyes flashed, and he also raised his gun to take aim. Although his marksmanship was good, he was separated by 800 meters, and it took him 2 shots to hit the front wheel of the car behind them. Both cars had broken down and lost their balance. The foreigners in the cars all jumped out to escape, but without the cars, it was very difficult to escape the pursuit of the colorful halo. Moreover, the bandits of Shelling Mountain had no intention of letting them go. O'Connor and the others were sitting in the first car, so they jumped out of the car and escaped relatively quickly. They were all agile and proficient in escaping. Laura supported an old white man as they escaped from his side. The bandits of Shelling Mountain were somewhat like the martial arts world, and they were unwilling to open fire on a woman and the old and weak. However, O'Connor did not receive such treatment. O'Connor saw a dark and skinny little man aiming his gun at him from afar. He frowned and vaguely felt that he was in great danger. He hurriedly rolled on the ground, and the sand in front of him was hit by the gun, and yellow smoke rose into the air. The British deputy director beside him was not so lucky. He was shot in half by Chignolo. O'Connor said in shock, "Are all the people in China sharpshooters? At such a distance, even in England, only the best fox hunters can hit them. If they were all so capable, why would they have allowed the British Empire's army to invade their capital?" Indiana Jones looked back and saw that the British people in the car that had fallen behind had been caught up by the colorful halo. The group of people were all enveloped by the colorful halo. Indiana knew how dangerous this rainbow-like halo was. When they were in a military camp, the explosives had blown up a hole in the underground palace, and he had seen with his own eyes the black and green soil at the entrance of the underground palace suddenly emit a white gas. It was like steam coming out of a stove in winter. At that time, he felt that something was wrong and told O'Connor, Laura, and the others to stay away from the white fog. Sure enough, not long after, the British soldiers who got close to the white fog started to wail, and pus flowed out of their mouths and noses. At that time, they thought that it was the poisonous gas that leaked out of the tomb, and for their own safety, they did not get close. O'Connor was the most sensitive. He had started the 2 trucks that were parked in the camp in advance. In just a short time, the flesh of the British soldiers began to fester. Under their gazes, the bodies of the soldiers who had come into contact with the white fog melted inch by inch into pus. The pus began to evaporate when it came into contact with the air, turning into white fog that floated up. At this time, they already knew that something was wrong. They hurriedly drove the trucks and a few British officers who had not been touched by the white fog and ran for their lives. At this time, at the entrance of the underground palace, under the ground near the camp, the pus that came out of the wailing British soldiers slowly rose like strands of white fog. It formed a colorful halo in the air and fell on the trucks, cannons, and iron tools. The iron and steel melted into molten iron. When it fell on the tents and clothes, the clothes melted as if they were soaked in acid. When it fell on people, they were like candles slowly melting in the white fog.